I stood at the edge of the dance floor, my hands trembling around a half-empty glass of champagne, watching my daughter's smile fade behind polite laughter. Her husband, my new son-in-law, raised his glass and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people build houses, some build futures. Guess which I do? The crowd laughed. My daughter looked away, and I just stood there, 70 years old, the man who built her childhood home, being called a useless old man in front of strangers. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just nodded, and quietly handed my lawyer a sealed envelope. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The chandeliers of the Charleston ballroom shimmered like captured lightning, scattering gold over a sea of silk and champagne. The air smelled of lilies, perfume, and expensive relief. Another perfect wedding under the Cole family name. Frank Harrison sat at the far end of the head table, half in shadow, his linen suit pressed to old-fashioned precision. Around him, laughter rolled like applause for a play he hadn't been cast in. Every so often, someone raised a glass in his direction without quite meeting his eyes. The band played soft jazz, and the servers refilled every glass except his. Blake Cole rose from his seat with a microphone in hand, the crowd's chatter fading as quickly as camera flashes igniting. His white tuxedo glimmered under the lights, perfectly matched to his sculpted grin. You know, he began, voice smooth as a salesman's pitch. Some people build houses. He paused for effect, his eyes cutting toward Frank with practiced casualness. And some build futures. Guess which I do? Laughter rippled across the room. A few guests covered their mouths, unsure if it was polite to laugh, but unwilling to miss the fun. Emily, radiant in her gown, tried to smile, tried to pretend the joke didn't land where it was aimed. Her hand found Blake's wrist under the table, a gentle warning to stop. He lifted his glass anyway, basking in the attention. Frank adjusted the silver cufflinks his late wife had given him. The sound of crystal chiming drew faintly from the band's instruments, but the rhythm in his chest was steadier, quieter. He looked at his daughter, her eyes darting between him and the man she'd just promised forever to, and felt something shift, like a beam giving way beneath fresh paint. He stood slowly, the old wooden chair creaking against marble floors. The microphone wasn't offered to him, he didn't need one. His voice carried with the calm of a man who'd spent decades shouting over storms and machinery. To my daughter and her husband, he said, raising his glass with measured grace. May you build something that actually stands. For a heartbeat, silence blanketed the room. A few polite clinks, followed a half-hearted echo of civility. Blake's smirk returned, lazy and cruel. Relax, old man, he said, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. Your tools are retired. This time, the laughter was sharper, cutting closer. Frank's hand didn't tremble, though the glass was heavier than it should have been. His eyes, pale and clear as worn sea glass, met Blake's. There was no flare of anger, only a quiet disappointment that carried more weight than rage could ever manage. He tipped his glass once more, drained it, and set it down with a deliberate click against the tablecloth. Emily stared down at her napkin, her smile frozen into something brittle. The band started playing again too soon, as if to patch over what everyone had witnessed. Someone whispered near the dessert table. Someone else coughed into their drink. But the sound that lingered wasn't laughter anymore. It was the soft hum of shame, too faint to claim, but impossible to ignore. Across the room, Daniel Reed watched the entire exchange from beside the bar. He didn't move, didn't react. His sharp eyes caught the small details, the trembling hand of the daughter, the false ease of the groom, the controlled composure of the father. When the toast ended, Daniel raised his own untouched glass just slightly in Frank's direction. The gesture was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried recognition, understanding. Frank didn't look back. He fixed his gaze on the ballroom's grand windows, where the reflection of the chandelier fractured into dozens of smaller lights, like stars refusing to stay still. Around him, the laughter picked up again, brittle and hollow. The band shifted to a livelier tune. Guests leaned in to gossip about honeymoons and headlines. Blake turned to charm the table beside him, already spinning his insult into a story about tough love between generations. Emily laughed when she had to, but her hand trembled as she set her glass down. At the end of the table, Frank sat quietly, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. His fingers brushed the edge of the cufflinks again, tracing the initials engraved on the back. M.H., his late wife's mark of steadiness. The clatter of silverware and the echo of Blake's arrogance blurred into one long, indistinct sound. In that noise, something settled behind Frank's calm eyes. A decision without words, a blueprint drawn not in ink, but in silence. Daniel's gaze lingered a moment longer before turning away. He knew the look of a man calculating, even when that man appeared perfectly still. And as Blake lifted his glass to make another round of jokes, the chandeliers flickered slightly above them, just enough for a few guests to glance up, while Frank remained motionless beneath the light, a shadow framed in gold, holding his silence like the beginning of a storm yet to come. Outside the ballroom, the air hummed with that particular chaos weddings create, sequins catching, flashbulbs, flower petals crushed under hurried shoes, and the photographer's sharp voice corralling people into neat, photogenic rows. Parents of the bride, bridesmaids next, everyone smile. Frank Harrison stood just off to the side, near a marble column, watching the careful choreography unfold. The light from the chandeliers poured through the glass doors, haloing Emily in her gown. She looked like a ghost of her mother for a fleeting second, and Frank felt his throat tighten. The photographer turned briskly. "All right, now let's get the Cole family together. Emily, your husband, his parents, siblings." Then a pause. The assistant leaned close to whisper something, but Blake beat him to it, murmuring in a tone meant to sound casual. "No need for extra shots with him." He nodded toward Frank, without looking directly at him. The words weren't loud, but they carried. The assistant froze mid-note. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came. A tremor ran through her as she looked from her father to her husband. For one split second, her eyes silently pleaded for Blake to take it back, but he didn't. Frank stepped forward, then stopped himself. He smiled faintly, polite and distant, the way one does when excusing themselves from a room where they're no longer welcome. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice even. "You all have plenty of people to fit in that frame." Emily's hand twitched as if to reach for him, but the photographer was already ushering the family into position. "Closer. Tilt your chin, Mrs. Cole." The flashes began again, white, mechanical bursts that lit up Blake's grin and Emily's forced composure. Near the edge of the scene, a small voice cut through the hum. "Why isn't Grandpa in the picture?" The flower girl, tiny, curls tumbling down her shoulders, stood holding her basket, head tilted in confusion. The photographer hesitated, his camera lowering slightly. The question hung in the air, echoing off marble and crystal like a bell toll. Nobody answered. Blake coughed into his fist. Emily blinked rapidly, her smile trembling. Frank looked down at the little girl and smiled softly. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said. "I'm taking a different kind of picture today." Margaret Price, standing just behind him, reached out and squeezed his arm. The pressure was warm, grounding. "You still built her life," she murmured, voice low enough that only he could hear. Frank turned his head slightly toward her, the hint of a smile touching his face, but not reaching his eyes. "I also built the roof she's marrying under," he replied, tone calm but edged with something colder, an old pride, wounded but unbroken. The photographer clapped his hands again. "Perfect. One more for safety." Another series of flashes went off, each one illuminating a picture that would look perfect in tomorrow's society pages. A young couple, radiant, surrounded by family. All except the man who had paid for the hall, the flowers, and the roof overhead. Frank stood at the edge of the light, half in shadow. He slipped his hands into his pockets, feeling the cool weight of his cufflinks, the same pair from the night before, engraved with his wife's initials. His thumb traced the tiny grooves, remembering the day she'd given them to him. "For when you need to hold your ground," she had said. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the distance, just beyond the harbor. It was faint, almost polite at first, then deepened, steady, warning. Guests murmured about an approaching storm, laughing it off as they shuffled back toward the ballroom. But Frank didn't move. He looked toward the window, watching the clouds drift in like bruises forming on the sky. Margaret followed his gaze. "Storm season's early this year," she said. He nodded once. "It's right on time." The thunder came again, closer now. The photographer's laughter faded behind the ballroom doors, replaced by music and chatter. Frank remained still for a long moment, then unclasped his cufflinks and slipped them into his pocket, closing his fist around them. The metal was warm from his skin, solid, grounding. When he finally turned to leave, his reflection lingered briefly in the glass, a solitary figure outside the frame of his own family's celebration. His face calm, composed. But behind those quiet eyes, something deliberate had begun to take shape. Not anger, not grief, blueprints. The reception hall shimmered with the soft chaos of celebration, champagne flutes clinking, laughter spilling over jazz melodies, and waiters weaving between tables like quiet dancers. Near the far wall, beneath a carved oak sign reading "Gifts and Blessings," the presents towered in perfect, glittering order. Silver ribbons, embossed cards, luxury boxes from designer boutiques, each a statement of wealth, not sentiment. Frank Harrison approached the table with a steady gait, the same deliberate rhythm he used on job sites when he wanted no one to notice the weight he carried. He held a small velvet envelope in his hand, almost lost against the gleam of crystal and gold. It was modest, unassuming, a soft dark blue that absorbed the light instead of throwing it back. He set it among the boxes without fanfare. His reflection in the polished tabletop looked older under the chandeliers, but his posture never wavered. Inside that envelope was no trinket, no token gesture. It was the deed to his lake house, the place where Emily had learned to ride a bike, to fish, to swim without fear, the place her mother had loved most. And now, on paper, it belonged to both of them, father and daughter, joint title. His final bridge, quietly offered. Blake appeared beside Emily, his cufflinks glinting like small declarations of ownership. "What's this?" he asked, lifting the envelope between two fingers. His tone wasn't curious, it was performative, the way a man might inspect an object before dismissing it. Emily reached for it. "Dad's gift," she said softly, as though naming it might protect it. Blake opened the flap, slid out the folded document, and read the top line aloud, amusement curling at the edges of his voice. "A deed to a lake house? Really?" He glanced up, his grin widening. "We've got better properties now." A few nearby guests turned their heads at the sound of his laughter, catching only fragments. Frank stood unmoving, hands behind his back. His voice came low, firm, but not cold. "It's more than a house," he said. "It's where she learned loyalty." The words settled between them like dust. Blake's grin faltered for a beat before he gave a short, dismissive chuckle. "Well," he said, tossing the papers back into the envelope and setting it aside among the gift boxes, "I guess we'll keep it for the nostalgia." Emily's eyes flashed, part embarrassment, part pain. She reached to retrieve the envelope, but her hand froze halfway. Around them, the music swelled again, a trumpet drowning the silence that followed. Frank studied her expression, saw the war behind her composure, the instinct to defend her husband against the man who'd raised her. He didn't fault her for it. He simply nodded once, the faintest dip of his head, and turned away. His shoes made no sound against the marble floor, but Margaret heard him go. She'd been standing close enough to witness every syllable, every gesture. Her silver hair caught the light as she moved closer to Emily, her voice a low thread cutting through the noise. "He just told you who he is," she murmured. Emily didn't respond. Her gaze lingered on the small envelope among the towering boxes. It looked so out of place, humble amid the extravagance, like a truth everyone wanted to overlook. Blake was already chatting with one of his banker friends, laughter resuming, as if the exchange hadn't happened at all. Across the room, Frank reached the exit doors, the cool air from the hallway brushing his face. He paused for a brief moment, his reflection framed in the glass, still calm, still controlled. Behind him, thunder rolled faintly again, closer now, echoing through Charleston's humid night like a warning whispered through the city's bones. He glanced once more toward the ballroom, the music, the laughter, the man his daughter had chosen. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then, with a quiet exhale, he slipped his hands into his pockets and stepped out into the corridor, leaving the velvet envelope behind like a cornerstone buried for a future no one else could yet see. The night had deepened into that perfect, deceptive stillness weddings are built for, glittering, forgiving, full of soft light and laughter. The band struck a slow, honeyed rhythm, couples filling the polished floor beneath the chandeliers. Every movement shimmered in the reflection of glass and silver. The world spun around Blake and Emily, their bodies close, smiling for the watching crowd. It was the kind of dance meant to be remembered in photographs. Frank Harrison sat near the exit, hands folded neatly in his lap. The table beside him had been cleared long ago. No drink, no centerpiece, just an empty linen square and a chair that faced the crowd without belonging to it. His posture was precise, like an old beam that had refused to bend even as the structure around it changed shape. The band's singer leaned toward the microphone. "Any requests from the happy couple?" he called, smiling broadly. Blake looked over the crowd, his expression suddenly bright with mischief. He leaned toward the DJ, whispered something, and then turned back toward the floor. The opening chords rolled through the speakers, slow, twanging, unmistakable. "Old man, look at my life." A wave of awkward laughter rippled across the guests. Blake's grin stretched wider, his arm tightening around Emily's waist. "It's just a song," he called out when she stiffened, mouthing a quick "stop." He twirled her once more for the audience, making sure every eye stayed on them. The lyrics carried through the room like an accusation. "Old man, take a look at my life. I'm a lot like you were." Some people laughed again, some didn't. Emily's eyes darted to her father's table, searching for his reaction. Frank didn't move. His face was unreadable. No flush of humiliation, no visible hurt. Only the faintest rise and fall of his chest gave away that he was still there, still breathing it in. The song stretched on, the cruel irony of it settling like dust. Blake caught his father-in-law's gaze across the floor, and for a fleeting moment, mistook Frank's stillness for defeat. He lifted his glass toward him with mock respect, as though sealing the moment in front of witnesses. Frank stood slowly. The sound of his chair scraping against the marble floor cut through the music, too quiet to interrupt but loud enough for Emily to notice. She reached out instinctively, a silent plea caught in her throat, but he didn't see her hand, or maybe he chose not to. He buttoned his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and gave the slightest nod toward the couple on the dance floor. It was polite, controlled, a gesture of civility that burned hotter than anger ever could. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his movements unhurried, the rhythm of his steps out of sync with the music behind him. Outside, Charleston's humid air pressed down like a memory. The first drops of rain tapped against the stone steps, darkening the pale marble in slow, irregular circles. Within minutes, the drizzle thickened into a full southern storm. Fat raindrops, steady thunder, and the smell of wet magnolia drifting in from the streets. Frank stepped beneath the awning, watching the water pool at the edges of the courtyard. His reflection shimmered on the slick ground, fractured by ripples. For Hawaii. The first time that night, he exhaled fully, a long, quiet breath that carried more than exhaustion. It carried acceptance. Behind him, the door creaked open. Margaret Price appeared, her silver shawl clutched tight against the wind. She had followed him through storms before, though none quite like this. "You won't say anything?" she asked, her voice firm but laced with concern. Frank's gaze stayed on the rain. "No," he said. His voice was level, stripped of emotion but heavy with meaning. "The lawyer will." Lightning flashed across the sky, throwing his profile into stark relief, the deep lines around his mouth, the steady eyes that had weathered far worse than humiliation. In that brief burst of light, his expression hardened, sculpted into quiet resolve. Controlled fury lived there, buried under decades of discipline and dignity. Thunder rolled, low and deliberate. He didn't flinch. The rain soaked the steps now, a relentless rhythm against the marble. Inside, the music carried on, oblivious. Margaret watched him for a long moment before speaking again, but he'd already turned slightly, his attention fixed on the horizon where the harbor lights blurred through the downpour. The storm illuminated him once more, briefly, sharply, and then left him in shadow, a man standing alone at the edge of a celebration that had turned into something else entirely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with direction, as if the night itself were waiting for him to move. Frank didn't yet know all the steps he would take next, but he knew this: some storms don't pass, they build foundations. And as lightning flared once more, reflecting in his calm eyes, the story of the useless old man began to shift, one blueprint at a time. Morning light slanted through the tall glass windows of the Charleston Harbor Hotel, soft and gold, wrapping the remnants of the wedding in a deceptive calm. The grand ballroom from the night before had been repurposed for breakfast, round tables dressed in linen, silver trays of fruit and croissants, the smell of coffee thick in the air. The laughter had returned, lighter now, casual, as if the storms of the previous night had never happened. Emily moved through the room with a practiced smile, thanking guests, accepting compliments, promising to send photos. Her white dress had been replaced by a pale sundress, but her eyes still carried the exhaustion of the night before. Blake followed a few steps behind her, sleeves rolled up, charisma reloaded, voice carrying just loud enough for every table to hear. "Maui tomorrow," he announced to a group of guests at the buffet. "Private villa, oceanfront, full concierge, nothing but the best for the new Mrs. Cole." He laughed easily, tapping his watch. "Just a small token of gratitude for surviving the most expensive wedding Charleston's seen this year." The crowd chuckled politely, though a few exchanged glances. There was a faint sharpness to his humor, the kind that carried over from arrogance rather than charm. At the far end of the room, the elevator doors slid open. Frank Harrison stepped out, his presence cutting through the easy chatter like a change in air pressure. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. In one hand, he carried a leather folder, simple, worn, deliberate. Conversation softened as he crossed the room. Even those who had ignored him the night before seemed unable to look away now. His calm drew attention the way silence does when everyone else is talking too loudly. Blake spotted him first. His grin wavered, then returned with forced brightness. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "look who's up early. Still playing businessman, Frank?" Frank stopped beside the table, his expression unreadable. "Still pretending to be one?" The words landed softly, but their precision cut clean. A few nearby guests tried, and failed, to smother their reactions. Blake's jaw twitched. Emily looked between them, her face tightening. "Dad," she began, but Frank was already nodding politely toward Margaret Price, who had followed a few steps behind. She held a thick envelope, sealed and stamped, with Daniel Reed's name written neatly on the front. Margaret set it on the table in front of Daniel, who had been quietly observing from a corner booth. "He said it was time," she told him. Daniel gave a slight nod, sliding the envelope into his briefcase without comment. Blake eyed the exchange, suspicion narrowing his smile. "What's this?" he asked lightly, tapping the folder in Frank's hand. "Some kind of construction plan?" Frank's answer was a slow, deliberate smile. "Something like that." Then he turned to Emily. For the first time that morning, his expression softened. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them automatically, her voice catching when she said, "You didn't have to come down, Dad." "I did," he said, his tone even, almost gentle. "You'll understand in time." He kissed her forehead, a brief, steady gesture that felt both like a blessing and a goodbye. Then he released her and straightened his jacket. Without looking back, he walked toward the exit. The steady rhythm of his shoes against the marble was the only sound in the sudden hush that followed. The moment he disappeared through the glass doors, the whispers began. "Was that about the trust?" someone murmured. "He's been meeting with lawyers for months." "I heard he's still sitting on half the coastal contracts in the city." Blake laughed, loud enough to drown the speculation. Relax, everyone, he said, lifting his mimosa. Maybe the will's in there. He winked toward Daniel, who had just closed his briefcase. For a moment, no one else laughed. Daniel's eyes flickered upward, catching Blake's grin, then settled briefly on Emily. There was something measured, almost regretful, in the way he regarded them. Like a man watching the first shadow of a storm he already knew was coming. He stood, adjusted his tie, and gave a small professional nod toward Margaret. "I'll take care of it," he said simply, before heading for the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, the reflection in the polished steel caught Emily's face. Confused, uneasy, as if she could sense that something important had shifted, but didn't yet know which direction the ground was moving. Outside, through the wide windows, rain had started again. Light at first, a soft tapping against the glass. Charleston rain always came in patterns. Gentle, patient, building towards something bigger. And at a table full of laughter, beneath chandeliers still warm from the night before, a sealed envelope sat in Daniel Reed's briefcase. Quiet, heavy, waiting to change everything. The guest suites of the Charleston Harbor Hotel were nearly silent that morning, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rain. Frank Harrison's room was neat, stripped of sentiment. Just a small suitcase on the bed, a folded shirt beside it, and the sound of gulls faint through the cracked window. He moved with measured calm, folding the last of his clothes and placing them in the case with deliberate precision. Every motion felt like punctuation, the quiet end of a sentence that had gone on too long. On the dresser lay his cufflinks, the same ones from the wedding, glinting dully in the pale light. He picked them up, turned them once in his palm, and placed them carefully in his inside pocket. They were no longer decoration, they were reminders of patience, of dignity, of control. Behind him, the door opened softly. Margaret Price stood in the frame, her expression a mix of tenderness and reprimand. "You really won't see her off?" she asked, voice low. Frank zipped the suitcase shut, not looking at her. "She chose a mirror that doesn't reflect her," he said evenly. "If I stand in front of it, I'd only block her view." Margaret exhaled through her nose, crossing her arms. "You always did believe silence solves everything." "Not everything," he said, lifting the suitcase from the bed. "Just the things that words ruin." She watched him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him pass. He nodded once in thanks, gentle, distant, and walked out into the hallway. The hotel corridor was lined with fading echoes of laughter from the night before. The faint smell of champagne still lingered in the carpet, mingled with the sterile scent of morning cleaning. Staff wheeled carts past, collecting half-empty bottles and discarded flowers, clearing away celebration as if erasing evidence. Frank's footsteps barely made a sound. Outside, the day had begun to break open, the storm clouds thinning, sunlight diffused through lingering mist. Charleston after rain always looked like a painting that hadn't quite dried. Frank loaded his bag into the back of his old truck, brushed water from the windshield, and slid behind the wheel. The engine rumbled awake, steady and low. He drove without haste through the narrow streets, the city still half asleep. The route carried him past the church, past the bakery where the wedding cake had been made, and finally past the grand hall that had held the reception. Workers were already there, dismantling the decorations, taking down garlands, wrapping cords, sweeping glitter into dull piles. Balloons deflated in corners like forgotten promises. He slowed at the curb, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. It was strange how quickly beauty could turn into debris. The same chandeliers that had witnessed laughter now hung cold and empty. At the next intersection, he stopped at a red light. A limousine rolled into view from the hotel driveway, glossy black against the gray of the wet street. Through the tinted glass, he could make out movement. Blake's hand, draped casually out the window, a cigar between his fingers. Emily sat beside him, face turned toward her phone, unaware or unwilling to look up. The limousine paused briefly beside his truck, and in that sliver of time, Blake noticed him. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. Blake lifted his hand in a lazy mock salute, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. Frank's response was a single, deliberate nod. No anger, no reaction beyond acknowledgement. His face remained still, carved from the same restraint that had kept him silent through worse storms. The light turned green. The limousine pulled away, tires hissing over wet asphalt, vanishing into the distance where the city blurred into coastline. Frank sat a moment longer, watching the taillights fade until they became nothing but faint red dots swallowed by the horizon. He rested his hands on the wheel, the faintest tremor running through his fingers, before he stilled them again. Then, in a low, steady voice, the kind meant not for the world, but for memory, he murmured, "Every insult is a blueprint. Some just take time to build." The words hung in the cab, quiet but weighted, as if the air itself recognized the shift from wounded silence to calculated resolve. Outside, the last of the storm clouds began to pull apart, revealing a strip of pale blue over the Charleston harbor. The ocean glimmered faintly in the distance, calm for now, but restless beneath the surface. Frank started the truck again. As he drove toward the coast, the camera of this imagined story would pull back, wide, cinematic, tracing the truck's slow movement along the highway, framed by the clearing sky and the silver ribbon of water stretching endlessly outward. The storm had passed, yes, but something else had begun. The Hawaiian sun spilled gold across the balcony, wrapping everything in the illusion of peace. Waves curled lazily against the shoreline, palm fronds swayed, and the sound of distant laughter drifted. Up from the resort pool, Emily sat curled in a wicker chair, barefoot, the hem of her silk robe brushing against her ankles. Her phone screen glowed in the soft morning light. Across from her, Blake lounged with a drink in hand, the kind of ease that came naturally to him when he felt admired. He scrolled through the same headlines she was reading, but where her eyes lingered, his only skimmed. Harrison Trust established, one article said. Another, retired contractor turns his legacy into moral clause. There was a photograph of Frank shaking hands with Daniel Reed outside a Charleston law office, dignified, calm, the caption calling him a man who built both houses and honor. Blake laughed, a sharp sound against the quiet sea. "Empty show from a senile old guy," he said, tossing his phone onto the table between them. The device landed next to an untouched breakfast tray, half a papaya, cold coffee, condensation sliding down the glass. Let him have his moment. People love a sentimental story. Emily didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on her screen, scrolling through the comments below the article. Frank Harrison rebuilt our pier after the storm. Man's a legend. Respect. We need more builders like him. Wish my dad had that kind of integrity. Her chest tightened with something unnameable. Pride, guilt, maybe both. She hadn't expected the world to remember her father so fondly. Blake noticed her silence and frowned. "Don't tell me you're actually buying into this," he said. "He's just showing off, trying to look noble before the grave." Emily's voice was soft, almost defensive. "He's not dead, Blake." "Could have fooled me," he said, taking another drink. "The man's been running on fumes since your mom passed." A gust of wind lifted the sheer curtains behind her, scattering sunlight across the table. Emily locked her phone and looked out at the ocean, the horizon burning orange and blue. For a moment, the world felt too beautiful for how heavy she suddenly felt. Later that afternoon, they went down to the resort boutique, picking out souvenirs for Blake's parents, pearls, cigars, a carved koa box. At the counter, Blake handed over his sleek black card with a flourish. The clerk smiled, swiped it, paused, then frowned. She tried again. The soft beep of denial broke the spell of ease around them. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice polite but cautious. "It's been declined." Blake's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. Try again." The same beep. Declined. Emily's heart began to pound. "Maybe the bank flagged it for travel," she offered quickly, her tone light, almost pleading. Blake forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, I'll use another." He pulled out a second card, another sleek black one, and handed it over. Another pause, another beep. He stared at the register like it had personally insulted him. Emily reached for her own card, a gold one her father had set up for her years ago. It went through easily. The clerk smiled, unaware she'd just triggered a quiet humiliation that would echo far beyond that counter. Back in the suite, Blake sat hunched over his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "All our joint accounts," he muttered. "They're linked to the Harrison Company. Why the hell would—" A chime interrupted him. Emily's phone buzzed with a new email notification from Daniel Reed. She opened it, the words sharp and formal against the calm background of paradise. This message serves as official notice of asset separation following the reorganization of the Harrison Trust. All accounts tied to Harrison Construction Holdings have been transitioned to independent oversight. Please contact our office for clarification. Blake read over her shoulder, his face hardening. "He did this," he said. "Your father did this." Emily's fingers trembled slightly around the phone. "He said I'd understand in time," she whispered. Outside, the sunlight dimmed. A line of gray clouds was gathering over the horizon, slow and deliberate, spreading like ink in water. The breeze that had once felt warm now carried a chill from the sea. Blake slammed his laptop shut, the sound jarring against the silence. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped, though she hadn't said a word. "We're fine. I'll fix this. He can't touch us." But his voice lacked its usual certainty. For the first time, Emily noticed the sweat on his temple, the restless tapping of his fingers. She turned toward the balcony, staring at the darkening sky. The waves that had shimmered gold an hour ago now rolled heavy and gray, a storm forming in the distance. A single thought pulsed in her chest, unwelcome, undeniable. Maybe the storm wasn't over. Maybe it was just coming for them now. The humid air of Charleston felt heavier than the Hawaiian breeze had ever been. The newlyweds' return was quiet, stripped of fanfare. The limousine that had once carried them off in triumph now pulled up to their townhouse in the historic district, with tinted windows hiding their silence. Blake didn't wait for the driver to open the door. He was already halfway up the steps, laptop under his arm, urgency etched into every stride. Inside, the house smelled faintly of new paint and cold coffee. Beautiful, expensive, empty. Emily set down her suitcase, glancing at the mail piled neatly on the counter. Bills, statements, and one thick envelope from Harrison Trust, unopened. Blake didn't notice. He was already at his desk, eyes fixed on the monitor, as numbers refreshed on screen after screen. The color drained from his face. "No," he muttered. "No, no, no." Emily stepped closer. "What is it?" He didn't look at her. "They're gone," he said flatly. "Frank's shares in Coal Bank. They're gone, completely liquidated." Her heart sank. "You mean sold?" "Transferred," Blake snapped, "to his trust, which means I've got nothing left in the company." He pulled the plug before we even landed. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the wood floor, and grabbed his phone. His father answered on the second ring, voice sharp, already irritated. "What did you do, Blake?" Blake exhaled, trying to sound composed. "Dad, listen, it's just temporary. Frank restructured his holdings, but we'll get it sorted." On the other end, silence stretched, cold and deliberate. Then, Mr. Cole's voice came back like the crack of a whip. "You married money you didn't own." "Dad, I told you she wasn't leverage. You made her a liability." The line went dead. Blake stood, frozen for a long second, the phone still in his hand. Then he hurled it across the room, where it struck the wall and fell, unbroken, but silent. Emily flinched. She opened the envelope from the counter, her hands unsteady. Inside was a short, formal letter from Daniel Reed's office. "Dear Ms. Cole, pursuant to the terms of the Harrison Trust, all distributions are temporarily paused, pending review of beneficiary conduct." She reread the line twice. "Pending review of beneficiary conduct," she whispered. "What does that even mean?" "It means your father's punishing us," Blake said, pacing now. "He's doing this on purpose. He's using his money like a leash." "Or maybe," she said quietly, "he's protecting what's his." Blake turned, anger flashing across his face. "Whose side are you on, Emily?" Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "I don't know anymore." The silence between them stretched taut. Then, in one abrupt motion, Blake swept the whiskey glass from his desk. It shattered against the floor, splintering into jagged shards. The crack that followed was sharp, echoing through the house like the punctuation to a truth neither wanted to speak. Something between them had broken too. Emily stepped back, her reflection fractured in the glossy floorboards, shards of glass catching her image in pieces. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her heels muffled by the rug. In another part of the city, Margaret Price and Daniel Reed sat in Daniel's office, blinds half drawn, the faint hum of ceiling fans cutting through the quiet. Margaret held a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "He's unraveling faster than I thought," she said softly. Daniel nodded, eyes on the stack of folders before him, bank statements, contracts, trust documentation. "That's how pressure works," he said. "You don't need to hit a man like that. Just remove his footing." Margaret looked toward the window, where rain streaked down the glass in thin, restless lines. "And Frank?" she asked. Daniel gave a faint, knowing smile. "He doesn't need to say anything. His letters are already doing the work." The camera, if there were one, would linger on Daniel's desk, the corner of a sealed envelope marked only with Blake and Emily's address, resting on a pile of correspondence. Outside, thunder rolled once, low and steady, somewhere over the harbor. And in the silence that followed, the story kept moving forward, carried not by Frank's presence, but by the quiet, relentless weight of his design. The morning air along the Charleston coast carried the smell of salt and wood, 2 scents Frank Harrison had spent a lifetime working with. His old property stretched before him, half transformed, a work site alive with motion. The foundation of his former dock had become the skeleton of a new public pier. Workers shouted to each other over the hum of saws and the cry of gulls. The sound wasn't noise to him, it was music, a reminder that building, at its core, was always an act of hope. As he stepped onto the planks, a few of the workers turned and called out, "Mr. Harrison." Their smiles were genuine, weathered faces lighting up with respect. One man, his hands streaked with paint, pointed to the new pilings. "We used your old designs, sir. The hurricane braces held up perfect." Frank smiled faintly. "They were built to," he said. "Everything worth keeping should be." He walked the length of the pier slowly, boots thudding against the damp wood, nodding to the people who greeted him. Some of them had worked under him years ago, others were sons of those who had. His legacy wasn't written in documents or awards, it was here, in the hands that still trusted what he'd built. At the far end of the pier, Daniel Reed waited beneath the shade of a temporary canopy, clipboard in hand, the wind tugging at his tie. He looked up as Frank approached. "Paperwork ready?" Frank asked, resting a hand on the railing, eyes on the ocean. Daniel tapped the folder against his palm. "Signed and waiting. The transfer makes the property a public landmark. Once the council signs off, this pier belongs to the city." Frank nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Then let's make the next part count." Daniel's brow lifted slightly. "You mean the donation?" Frank turned to face him fully. "Veteran housing, near the shipyards. Too many of them built homes for others, and never had one themselves." His voice carried quiet conviction, unshakable. Daniel hesitated. "You realize what this will look like, right? The Coles won't take it lightly. Public charity, moral spotlight, it'll provoke them." A faint smile touched Frank's mouth, the kind that came not from amusement, but from recognition. "I built hurricanes into my designs, Daniel. I don't fear a little wind." The younger man nodded, conceding the point. He'd seen that look before, the one that meant Frank had already thought 3 moves ahead. Later, inside the modest construction office near the site, Frank sat before a small camera on a tripod. The afternoon sun poured through the window, glinting off the framed photograph on the wall. A younger Emily, about 10, grinning in a hard hat 2 sizes too big. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked into the lens. "Emily," he began softly, "you once asked me why I never sold this place. It wasn't about money, it was about meaning. These boards, every nail, every beam, they taught me something, that what's built right doesn't crumble when the weather turns." He paused, the silence heavy, but warm. "You'll learn that too. It's not about building wealth. It's about building something that lasts when wealth fades. Loyalty, work, respect. Those are the only foundations that don't rot." He exhaled slowly, eyes steady on the lens. I hope one day you'll see that. And when you do, you'll know I never left you behind. I just wanted to make sure you could stand on your own ground. He clicked the camera off and turned to Daniel. Schedule the upload. For when? Daniel asked. The day of Blake's next business launch. Frank's tone was even, unhurried, but there was steel beneath it. Daniel blinked, then gave a small, knowing nod. Consider it done. As Frank stepped outside again, the late sun hit the water, scattering gold across the waves. Workers laughed nearby, the sound blending with the rhythmic hammering of nails. The pier stretched toward the horizon, unfinished but sturdy. He looked out at it for a long moment, hands in his pockets, eyes narrowing slightly against the wind. Somewhere beyond that horizon, storms were gathering again. And Frank Harrison, quiet builder, patient architect of justice, was already readying the foundations. The ballroom of Charleston's newest waterfront hotel gleamed like a cathedral of modern ambition, marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, spotlights tracing soft arcs across a forest of champagne glasses. The guests, bankers, investors, reporters, mingled in curated excitement. Tonight was Blake Cole's night. The banners behind the stage read in clean, minimalist font, Cole Capital, the future built on trust. Frank Harrison's name was nowhere to be seen, but his shadow lingered just beneath the perfection of the decor. Blake worked the crowd with his usual practiced charm, his tuxedo crisp, his laughter loud enough to dominate the room. Emily stood near the champagne tower, her gown understated but elegant, her expression polite, detached. She smiled when the cameras pointed her way, but her eyes rarely met her husband's. Ladies and gentlemen, Blake said into the microphone, voice booming with confidence, tonight marks the beginning of something lasting, a firm founded on legacy, mine, and those who share my vision for growth, transparency, and trust. Applause rippled through the room. Flashbulbs went off. Blake's grin widened as he nodded to the AV technician. Let's show them what we've built. The screens behind him flickered to life. Company logos, stock projections, architectural renderings, everything perfectly timed. But then, abruptly, the visuals glitched. Static filled the screens for half a second. The sound cut out. A few guests murmured, puzzled. Then the image returned. Only it wasn't Blake's promotional video. It was Frank Harrison. The shot was simple. Frank seated in his construction office, sunlight slanting across his weathered face. His voice came through clear and calm. Integrity outlasts profit, he said. The room fell silent. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. The footage cut to scenes of Frank at the pier, handing over donation checks to workers in hard hats, shaking hands with veterans as new housing units rose behind them. Every frame was real, recent, undeniable. On one screen, a familiar face appeared, one of the men Blake had fired from his firm 2 years prior, smiling as Frank handed him a set of keys to a new apartment. Every builder, Frank's voice continued, leaves behind more than blueprints. He leaves a reputation, and some reputations. The video lingered on Blake's old company logo, collapsed faster than the foundations they were built on. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier evaporated. In its place came a ripple of whispers. Reporters raised their phones. Guests turned toward one another with wide eyes and hushed disbelief. Blake's smile cracked, his color draining beneath the spotlight. Turn it off, he barked toward the AV booth. No one moved quickly enough. The footage kept playing. Emily stood frozen, staring at the screen. The sound of her father's voice, measured, patient, resolute, hit her like a chord she hadn't realized she'd been missing. This, Frank said in the final seconds, is what we build for. Not applause, not wealth, but decency that survives us. The screen faded to black. For one long heartbeat, there was nothing but silence and the hum of the projector cooling down. Then the murmurs began in earnest, faint at first, then rising, spreading like wildfire. Was that live? He really said that? Cole fired those men, didn't he? Blake stepped forward, eyes burning, jaw locked. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice tight. That was... A reporter interrupted, camera raised. Mr. Cole, did you authorize those layoffs he mentioned? He ignored her, but his voice trembled. This is a misunderstanding. Some kind of hack. Another camera flash, then another. Emily looked up, meeting her husband's eyes. For the first time, she saw fear there, raw, desperate. He reached for her hand. She didn't move. The crowd began to part, their admiration turning to quiet curiosity tinged with doubt. Blake's confidence faltered completely. His hand, still clutching his glass, trembled. Then, in a sudden violent gesture, he hurled it downward. The glass shattered across the marble floor, wine splashing red against his shoes. The cameras caught everything. Gasps filled the room, followed by the mechanical staccato of shutters and the rising tide of reporters shouting questions. The image of him, furious, broken, drenched in the very symbol of celebration, was captured from every angle. Emily took a single step back. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind. Integrity outlasts profit. The music never resumed. The crowd didn't clap. By the time the lights dimmed and the projection screens flickered to black again, Blake Cole's reputation had begun to implode. Not gradually, but in real time, under the same lights that had once made him shine. Outside, unseen beyond the glass walls of the ballroom, the Charleston harbor shimmered under a low, dark sky. The tide was rising again. The Charleston evening had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. The distant roll of waves, the hum of cicadas, the whisper of wind through the moss-draped oaks. Frank Harrison sat on the porch of his coastal house, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The television inside had been running muted all day, looping footage of Blake's disastrous launch party. The anchor's voices may as well have been thunder in another world. He didn't need to hear the commentary. He'd already seen the collapse written on Blake's face. Margaret Price sat across from him, reading through a stack of papers by lamplight. Her glasses caught the warm glow, hiding her eyes, though she didn't need to look up to sense Frank's stillness. It wasn't triumph she saw in him. It was the heavy quiet of a man who'd carried too much dignity for too long. The phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with one word, Emily. Frank stared at it for a moment before picking up. His voice was calm, almost soft. "Hi, sweetheart." Her reply came sharp and breathless. "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer immediately. "Do what?" "That video, Dad. That ambush. You humiliated him in front of everyone." Her voice cracked on the last word, the sound of someone caught between loyalty and shame. "You didn't have to destroy him like that." Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the horizon where the sea met the darkening sky. "I didn't humiliate him," he said evenly. "He built his own stage. I just turned on the lights." There was a pause, a fragile silence thick with disbelief. "You sound proud of it," she whispered. "Of hurting him, of making me choose between you." "Emily," Frank said quietly, "I didn't ask you to choose. I just stopped pretending that both sides were equal." The wind rustled through the marsh grass. For a long moment, neither spoke. When Emily did, her voice was trembling but defiant. "You always talk about integrity and values. Where's the integrity in revenge?" Frank's hand tightened on the armrest. "You want to talk about integrity?" His tone didn't rise, but the weight behind it changed. "Did you defend me that day?" The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere through the phone he could hear the faint catch of her breath. He didn't press her. He didn't have to. Truth didn't need volume. It only needed space. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its certainty. "You think I don't regret it?" she said softly. "That moment at the wedding? I saw what he did, what he said. I didn't want to make it worse." Frank closed his eyes. "You can't fix a crack by pretending it's not there, sweetheart. You can only rebuild what you admit is broken." Neither said goodbye. The call ended not with closure, but with the brittle sound of disconnection, the kind that lingers longer than words. Frank placed the phone back on the table, face down. The night deepened around them, the sound of the tide rising slow and steady. Margaret had stopped pretending to read. She studied him quietly, seeing the flicker of emotion cross his face. Not satisfaction, not victory, but something older, deeper. "You didn't enjoy that," she said quietly. No, Frank replied. But he did. He reached for the envelope sitting beside the lamp, sealed and stamped. The corner bore Daniel Reed's signature. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What's that? The next packet, Frank said. Moments later, Daniel's headlights swept across the gravel drive. He stepped onto the porch, the sea wind tugging at his coat. You're sure about this one? He asked. Frank handed him the envelope. It's time, he said simply. Daniel nodded, slipping it into his briefcase. You know this will hit him harder than the video. I know. Frank leaned forward slightly, the porch light tracing the hard lines of his face. He built his empire on debt. Let's see how well it stands when the ground shifts. Daniel didn't need more explanation. The packet contained the ownership transfer for Blake's office building mortgage, one that now belonged to the Harrison Trust. A silent move, legal and final. As Daniel walked back to his car, Margaret spoke from her chair. You're dismantling him piece by piece. Frank's gaze stayed fixed on the dark horizon. No, he said, I'm just showing him what happens when a house is built without a foundation. The engine started. Headlights receded down the long drive, swallowed by the mist. Margaret looked at him, searching for something, remorse perhaps, but found only stillness. And what happens after this? She asked softly. Frank didn't answer. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip of coffee gone cold, and let the silence hang between them like a drawn line. Inside the house, the muted TV flickered again. Blake's face caught mid-outburst at his party, the caption beneath reading, Coal Capital under investigation. The screen's light cast long shadows across Frank's porch. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. The countermove was already in motion. The morning broke heavy and gray over downtown Charleston. Clouds hung low, thick with the promise of rain. Inside the glass tower of Coal Capital, the offices glowed with artificial light, sterile and bright against the storm-dark sky. Blake Cole strode through the lobby with the same swagger that had once made headlines. But today, the receptionist didn't greet him with her usual smile. She only nodded quickly, eyes flicking to the elevator doors. Something in her silence unsettled him. He rode up to the 21st floor, the hum of the elevator echoing in the small metal space. His reflection in the mirrored walls looked sharper, older. He adjusted his tie, muttering under his breath, "They'll see soon enough." When the doors slid open, he walked into the office, expecting the usual rhythm of chatter and screens. Instead, the room was still. His assistant wasn't at her desk. A stack of envelopes sat on the polished mahogany surface, one on top marked "Confidential, Foreclosure Notice." Blake froze. The seal bore the Harrison Trust emblem. He tore it open. The words hit him like cold steel. Notice of repossession and transfer of ownership. Coal Capital headquarters, effective immediately. Leased under management of the Harrison Trust. His pulse thundered in his ears. No, he said aloud, as though saying it could make it untrue. He flipped through the rest of the pages. Legal filings, signatures, dates. All perfectly legitimate. Every line told him the same thing. The building he'd claimed as his legacy was no longer his. Rage replaced disbelief. He snatched the papers and stormed toward the legal office down the hall, shoving open the glass doors so hard they rattled in their frames. Daniel Reed was waiting. Calm, composed, already seated at the conference table with a neat folder open before him. His tie was perfectly knotted, his posture unbothered. "Mr. Cole," Daniel said, voice measured, courteous. "I was expecting you." Blake slammed the papers down on the table. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble and glass. Daniel didn't flinch. He glanced at the documents as though reviewing something trivial. "It's already done." "This is my company," Blake spat. "My building, my name on the damn lease." Daniel folded his hands. "Correction, your former company. The mortgage on this property was secured through Harrison Construction's guarantees. When the trust restructured, ownership transferred automatically. Everything has been filed, notarized, and accepted by the bank." Blake stared at him, chest heaving. "You think you can just—" "I didn't," Daniel interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Harrison did." The name hit harder than the notice itself. For a heartbeat, Blake said nothing. Then he laughed, a brittle, angry sound that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, the old man couldn't leave it alone. He's been planning this for months, hasn't he? Daniel didn't answer. Silence in his hands was sharper than any retort. Blake stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at him. You tell Frank he's declared war. Daniel's voice stayed calm. He doesn't need to. You already lost it. Two security guards appeared at the doorway, called by a silent signal. Mr. Cole, one said quietly, we'll need you to leave the premises. Blake turned on them, incredulous. This is my office. Not anymore, Daniel said, standing. His tone was professional, almost sympathetic. You'll receive the formal transition paperwork within 24 hours. I'd recommend collecting your personal belongings before then. For a moment, Blake just stood there, anger, disbelief, and humiliation crashing through him all at once. He looked around the room that had once been his empire, the glass walls, the view of the harbor, the nameplate on his door. He'd built this space as a monument to control, and now he couldn't even stand in it without permission. The guards waited silently. Finally, Blake straightened his jacket, forcing composure he didn't feel. You think this is over? He said, his voice low, shaking. Tell him. Daniel met his gaze evenly. He already knows. The guards escorted Blake out. His footsteps echoed through the empty hall, the same lonely cadence that had followed Frank out of the wedding ballroom months earlier. Poetic symmetry in motion. Outside, the rain had started. Heavy, relentless. Charleston rain, the kind Frank had always said could wash away even the strongest veneer. Blake stepped onto the sidewalk as thunder cracked overhead, his reflection breaking apart in the puddles at his feet. Across town, Emily sat at her kitchen table, a notice envelope in her trembling hands. The words blurred as she read. Effective immediately, the Cole Capitol building has been transferred to the Harrison Trust. She stared at the letter, mouth dry, realizing this wasn't just punishment, it was design. Her father's architecture, built in silence, rising around them one move at a time. Outside her window, the same storm pounded the city. The sky split with lightning, the harbor swelling under sheets of rain. And somewhere along the coast, far from the noise and fury, Frank Harrison stood at his window, watching that same storm roll in. His face calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Blueprints never lie. They just take time to reveal what they were meant to build. The morning sun rose soft over Charleston's harbor, glinting off scaffolds and steel beams. The air smelled of sawdust, paint, and wet earth, the scent of progress. On a modest patch of reclaimed land, where an abandoned warehouse once stood, the new Harrison Veterans Housing Project was taking shape. Rows of small homes lined the site, clean and sturdy, built with hands that had known war and weather. Frank Harrison stood before the half-finished buildings in his work jacket, no tie, no entourage, just him, Margaret Price, Daniel Reed, and a handful of reporters. His hair caught the wind. His presence grounded the space more than any podium could. A small wooden sign beside him read, "Built by those who served." One reporter raised a hand, camera light blinking red. "Mr. Harrison, you've been in the headlines a lot lately. The incident at your son-in-law's launch party, was that your doing?" A murmur of curiosity rippled through the group. Frank took his time answering. He didn't fidget or smile for the cameras. His hands rested lightly on the podium, rough and scarred from decades of work. "I've spent my life building things," he said, his voice low but carrying. "I prefer construction to destruction." The line landed perfectly. Pens paused mid-scratch. Cameras zoomed in. Frank didn't elaborate. He simply turned toward the workers behind him, giving them the acknowledgement that the question didn't deserve. Another reporter spoke up. "Some say you're using charity to get back at Blake Cole, your son-in-law. Any comment?" Frank's gaze returned to the crowd, steady and unreadable. "You can't rebuild anything by tearing someone else down," he said, "but you can show them what real foundations look like." Margaret, standing off to the side, smiled faintly. It wasn't a performance, it was clarity, delivered with the quiet force of truth. The conference lasted 15 minutes, no longer. Frank didn't speak about his family. He spoke about the veterans who'd built the homes, the funding going into training programs, the importance of purpose over profit. When it ended, he shook hands with workers instead of reporters. Cameras caught everything: his simplicity, his humility, his refusal to defend himself. By afternoon, the clip was everywhere. "Old man builds back better," one headline read. "Integrity outlasts profit, the Harrison way," said another. The internet loved him, the quiet dignity, the lack of pretense. The image of Frank standing under a half-built roof, sunlight haloing him, became the photograph of the week. Emily sat alone in her apartment, watching the clip on her tablet. The comment section scrolled endlessly. "That's a real man. Wish more CEOs talked like this. His daughter should be proud." Each line hit harder than the last. Her thumb hovered over the screen as her eyes blurred. For the first time in months, the anger she'd held toward her father began to loosen into something else. Shame, maybe. Or longing. She whispered under her breath, "He never even defended himself." Across the city, Blake Cole was not whispering. He paced his office, what was left of it, half empty now, stripped of the company logos that once declared his name. His face glowed blue from the phone screen as he scrolled through the trending topics, each one another blow to his pride. Frank Harrison, old man strong, show integrity, outlasts profit. His humiliation had become a movement. He slammed the phone onto his desk, hands gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened. Then, impulsively, he grabbed it again and began typing. "This man isn't noble. He's a manipulative fraud hiding behind blue-collar pity. Don't let old age fool you." He hit post. Within minutes, the replies came flooding back. "You're just mad he exposed you. Still blaming everyone but yourself? Maybe learn to build something before you talk about builders." The screen glared in his face, a wall of digital judgment. He tossed the phone across the room, where it shattered against the wall. Back at the construction site, Margaret watched Frank speaking quietly with a veteran about carpentry apprenticeships. "You don't fight storms by shouting at the rain," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Frank turned to her, eyes crinkling with a tired but certain smile. "Exactly," he said. "You raise better roofs." The words settled between them with the weight of truth earned, not spoken. Overhead, the sky darkened slightly, the first distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the coast. The workers didn't stop. They hammered, lifted, measured. Frank watched them, unbothered by the coming rain. He knew storms came and went. What mattered were the structures left standing when the skies cleared. And somewhere across town, as lightning touched the harbor, Blake Cole stared at the shattered remains of his phone, his empire crumbling around him, while the man he'd called useless stood calmly, building something that would outlast them both. The restaurant was tucked away on a narrow Charleston street, the kind of place that whispered rather than announced itself. No music, no clinking chaos, just soft candlelight, the faint scent of rosemary and sea air drifting through open windows. It was a quiet refuge for conversations that couldn't survive anywhere louder. Frank Harrison sat at a small corner table, posture straight, hands folded loosely on the white linen. He had arrived early, as always, watching the flame of the single candle flicker against the glass. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window, his weather, his rhythm. At 7:12, the door opened. Emily stepped in, her coat drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked smaller than he remembered, less like the bride from that gleaming ballroom, more like the child he used to lift onto the hood of his truck to watch storms roll in. She paused when she saw him, then approached quietly, her heels soft against the floor. "Hi, Dad." "Emily." He rose, slightly, nodding, then gestured to the seat across from him. "You look tired." "I am." She managed a small, fragile smile as she sat down. "It's been a long few months." The waiter came and went, leaving 2 glasses of water and the comfort of distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken years. Finally, Emily drew a deep breath. "I know this doesn't fix anything," she said, voice trembling at the edges, "but I needed to see you without lawyers, without press, without him. Frank nodded, listening. His silence wasn't cold, it was an invitation. She looked down at her hands, twisting the napkin slowly. I married a mirror of my worst fears, she said at last. Someone who made me feel seen for all the wrong reasons, and I let him turn me into something I'm not. Her words landed like quiet admissions of guilt, but there was strength beneath them, cracked, emerging, real. Frank studied her face, his expression unreadable but softening. Then you know how to rebuild, he said. She met his eyes for the first time that night. You make it sound simple. It's not, he replied, but neither is anything worth building. Their meals arrived, salmon for him, a salad she barely touched. The candle flickered low as time passed in patient silence. I didn't come for money, Emily said suddenly, her voice firmer now. Or explanations. I came because I needed to remember how to be my mother's daughter. Frank's hand stilled on his glass. For the first time, his composure faltered, just slightly. He leaned forward, his tone low, steady. Your mother would have told you the same thing I'm about to tell you. Trust isn't inherited. It's built brick by brick. You can lose it overnight, but earning it back... He exhaled slowly. That takes weathering the storm, not running from it. Emily nodded, tears glinting but unshed. Do you think you'll ever forgive him? She asked quietly. Frank's gaze shifted to the rain streaking the window, his reflection ghosted beside hers. No more than I'd forgive a storm for being wet. Her lips parted slightly, half a gasp, half a laugh, that never formed. You really believe that? I believe people show you what they are, he said. But I also believe you don't need to hate a storm to rebuild after it. You just need better tools. For the first time all night, she smiled through the tears. It wasn't wide or easy, but it was real. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. You're still teaching, aren't you? He chuckled softly. Some lessons take longer to sink in. When they finished, she stood before he could. Thank you, she said simply. For dinner, for not saying I told you so. Frank rose slightly again, a quiet gentleman's reflex. I'd rather you say it one day, to yourself. She blinked, her tears finally falling, and nodded before walking toward the door. The bell above it chimed softly as she stepped into the rain. Frank stayed seated, watching the empty chair across from him. Outside, he could see her pause beneath her umbrella, looking up at the storm before walking away. He didn't move, didn't follow. The candle flickered out, leaving him in the amber afterglow of a conversation that hadn't fixed anything, but had started to. The news broke quietly at first, just a whisper in Charleston's financial circles, a rumor that something ugly was brewing beneath the polished marble of the city's boardrooms. Within days, whispers turned to headlines: civil suit filed against Blake Cole, forgery allegations under investigation. Daniel Reed's name appeared beneath the filing. The complaint was clean, airtight, impossible to misinterpret. Every page detailed how, 6 months before the wedding, Blake had used Frank Harrison's digital signature to secure a private business loan, one that funded the early days of Cole Capital. The forgery had gone unnoticed for months, hidden under layers of banking paperwork and charm. But now, every document bore the truth in black and white. Blake's reaction was instant and furious. He stormed into his attorney's office, the headline printout crumpled in his fist. It's false, he hissed. The man's making this up to ruin me. His lawyer didn't look convinced. Daniel Reed doesn't make mistakes, he said quietly, sliding the papers back across the desk. The timestamps match your pre-wedding accounts. The metadata on the signature, it's identical to Mr. Harrison's. It's over, Blake. Blake's face twisted. I'll handle this myself. But outside his office walls, the tide had already turned. Cole family patriarch Everett Cole wasted no time distancing himself from the fallout. Reporters swarmed his gated estate, but all they got was a crisp statement from his spokesperson. The Cole family has no involvement in the business dealings of Mr. Blake Cole. We are shocked and saddened by these allegations. In a single sentence, Blake had been cut loose. He read the statement twice, standing alone in his kitchen as the words sank in like cold knives. His father's number went straight to voicemail. The silence said more than rejection. It said shame. Meanwhile, Emily sat in a small conference room across town, hands clasped in her lap as she gave her statement to investigators. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, the air heavy with paperwork and stale coffee. Her voice didn't waver when she described what she knew, the signatures, the dates, the inconsistencies she'd once brushed off as her husband's business confidence. When she finished, Daniel closed his file and looked at her quietly. "You did the right thing," she nodded, eyes downcast. "It doesn't feel like it." "It will," he said, "eventually." Across the harbor, reporters had gathered outside Frank Harrison's coastal property. Microphones clustered like weeds near his gate. The questions came in waves. "Mr. Harrison, did you know your son-in-law forged your signature? Are you seeking restitution or revenge? Do you have a statement for your daughter?" Frank stepped outside briefly, wearing his old work jacket, the kind with salt stains along the cuffs. His eyes swept across the crowd, calm but distant. "I have nothing to add," he said simply. "The court will speak for itself." The restraint was surgical. No elaboration, no outrage, just composure, the kind that made every soundbite stronger. The cameras followed him as he walked back inside, closing the door behind him with the slow finality of a man who already knew how this would end. By that evening, Charleston was buzzing. Every cafe, every bar, every street corner had someone talking about the coming trial. The old guard of the city loved nothing more than a scandal dressed in respectability, and this one had everything: money, betrayal, bloodlines. Online, public opinion was merciless. Once celebrated for his charm and ambition, Blake was now painted as a fraud, his fall from grace dissected with fascination. Headlines turned sharper. From banker to forger. Old man outsmarts the golden boy. Through it all, Frank remained unseen. No interviews, no statements. Only Daniel's efficient precision moved the chessboard forward. Every motion, every filing, every date set exactly as planned. When the court clerk finally posted the official notice, it was like a storm warning pinned to the courthouse door: Cole v. Harrison Trust. Preliminary hearing set for August 14th. That night, Daniel stood in Frank's study, the ocean wind rustling through the cracked window. "It's done," he said. "The court date's set." Frank didn't look up from his papers. "Then the foundation's ready," he said. "Now we see what holds." Outside, the rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady, drumming against the glass. Charleston's signature storm, rolling in again. The stage was set, and this time, the courtroom would be the house he built. By mid-morning, the Charleston County Courthouse felt more like a theater than a hall of justice. The air was heavy with whispers, camera clicks, and the hum of gossip. Locals filled the wooden benches shoulder to shoulder, bankers in tailored suits beside construction workers in worn boots, all drawn by the same strange magnetism: the fall of Blake Cole. The front row was a portrait of quiet contrast. Daniel Reed sat still, a folder of documents neatly stacked before him. Beside him, Frank Harrison was motionless, hands resting on his cane. He didn't need the support. It was more an anchor than a crutch. His expression gave away nothing: no anger, no satisfaction. Just the steady calm of a man who'd learned long ago that patience outlasts pride. Across the aisle, Blake sat with his attorney, his once perfect posture gone rigid. His tailored suit looked like armor that no longer fit. Every flash of a camera made his jaw tighten. When the bailiff called the court to order, he flinched slightly, as though the sound itself had weight. Judge Hollis entered, a woman known for her precision and intolerance for theatrics. "Court is now in session," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes scanning the room. "We are here to hear the case of Harrison Trust versus Cole Capital. Let's proceed." Blake's lawyer rose first, his words slick and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my client is not a criminal. He is a victim of circumstance, of vindictive age, and of a man who cannot accept being replaced." He gestured toward Frank, his voice swelling with mock sympathy. "This is not fraud. This is a family feud. Mr. Harrison's bitterness has turned into litigation." The gallery murmured. Blake lifted his chin, feeding off the drama. Everything I did, he said suddenly, breaking form, was to protect my family, my wife, my company. I was set up by a man who can't stand not being in control. His voice wavered on the edge of desperation. He's obsessed with legacy. Mine, his, everyone's. Judge Hollis raised a hand. You'll have your turn, Mr. Cole. Sit down. Daniel stood next. His composure filled the room like gravity. Your Honor, he began, his voice low but cutting through the murmurs, we are not here to debate emotions. We are here to discuss evidence. He lifted a tablet from his briefcase and approached the bench. Exhibit B, he said, clicking play. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen came to life. The video footage flickered. A familiar ballroom, gold chandeliers, laughter. The wedding. The moment when Blake's voice echoed through the speakers. Relax, old man. Your tools are retired. The sound hung in the courtroom, colder now, crueler without music or applause. Then Daniel spoke again. This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of disrespect, public, deliberate. And while disrespect isn't a crime, forging a man's name to secure a $4.2 million loan is. He slid the loan documents across to the clerk, each page marked with the digital signature, Frank's name, time-stamped months before the wedding. The metadata confirms the file was accessed from Mr. Cole's home network. Blake's lawyer objected weakly, but Judge Hollis overruled it without hesitation. Her eyes skimmed the papers, her mouth tightening as she reached the final page. When she looked up, the weight in her voice filled the room. Forgery is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Cole. It is theft of trust, of credibility, of name. Blake's face crumpled, his practiced charm dissolving into panic. He wanted me to fail, he said hoarsely. He planned this. Judge Hollis ignored the outburst. The evidence speaks clearly. I find the defendant guilty of fraud and misrepresentation. Sentencing, 1 year probation, full restitution to the Harrison Trust, and immediate relinquishment of corporate assets. The gavel struck wood, final and sharp. For a long moment, the room was silent. Cameras clicked. Whispers rose. The hum of Charleston gossip returning like wind after thunder. Frank didn't react. He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward the exit. Daniel remained seated, watching him go. Margaret, from the back row, caught Frank's eye as he passed, a silent exchange that carried both victory and ache. Blake's voice echoed after him, desperate. You think this makes you better than me? You ruined me. Frank didn't turn around. His footsteps were measured, echoing off marble floors as he moved down the long courthouse corridor. Reporters pressed forward, shouting questions, but he passed through them like smoke. Outside, sunlight cut through a sky just beginning to clear. The storm had broken overnight, leaving puddles scattered across the courthouse steps. Frank's reflection rippled in one as he walked through it, steady, calm, resolved. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply kept walking, each step slow, deliberate, unhurried. Behind him, the noise of the courtroom bled into the distance, the chaos he'd outlasted, the justice he'd built brick by brick. For most, this was an ending. For Frank Harrison, it was just the quiet between storms. The Charleston courthouse looked different this time, smaller somehow, quieter. The storm of flashbulbs and media had moved on, leaving only the sound of rain tapping gently against the tall windows. Inside, the conference room smelled faintly of old wood and ink. The air was still, but heavy with the kind of finality that made people whisper instead of speak. Emily Cole sat at the end of the long oak table, pen trembling lightly between her fingers. Her wedding ring sat in front of her, not on her hand, just a small, unremarkable circle of gold, glinting under the overhead light. Margaret Price sat beside her, composed and patient, offering presence instead of advice. Across the table, the clerk slid the final set of divorce papers forward. "All we need is your signature, Mrs. Cole," he said quietly. She hesitated, looking down at the papers. Her name still carried his, Blake's. For a heartbeat, she saw flashes of the life she'd built around that name. The wedding, the champagne, the laughter that had never reached his eyes. Then she thought of the courtroom, of her father's silent strength as everything came undone. Her pen touched the page. The sound of ink on paper was faint, final. When she finished, Margaret placed a gentle hand over hers. "It's done," she said softly. Emily nodded, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her eyes glistened, not with relief or sorrow exactly, but something in between, like someone standing in the calm after thunder. 2 days later, she moved into a small apartment overlooking the Charleston harbor. The space was modest, bare floors, white walls, the smell of salt water drifting through the open window. Boxes lined the floor, each one marked in her careful handwriting. There was peace in the quiet, even if it still felt borrowed. That afternoon, there was a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Frank stood there, rain jacket still dripping from the storm outside. He didn't speak right away, just offered a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of everything words couldn't mend. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course." The apartment looked lived in but unfinished, one cabinet hanging crooked, a drawer refusing to close properly. Frank noticed it instantly. Old habits never died. His eyes went to flaws before beauty. "You've got a loose hinge," he said. She smiled faintly. "I've been meaning to fix it." He walked to the kitchen, pulling a small screwdriver from his pocket like he'd known he'd need it. In silence, he worked. The sound of metal against wood filled the room, steady, rhythmic, oddly comforting. Emily leaned against the counter, watching him. "You still fix things," she said softly. He paused for a moment, turning one final screw, then looked up at her. "Only what's worth keeping." The words hung between them, warm and heavy. Emily blinked back tears she hadn't planned to shed. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For coming. For not saying, 'I told you so.'" Frank smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "I don't fix people, Emily. I just make sure they have a place to rebuild." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, faint at first, then closer. Emily moved toward the window. Red and blue lights flashed somewhere across the harbor, reflecting off the slick streets. The sound carried through the rain like an echo of a story still finishing itself. "Is that—" she began. Frank nodded once, slowly. "Blake," he said. "Tax fraud. They found more." She said nothing, just stared at the horizon, her reflection blurred in the rain-streaked glass. Her father joined her at the window, standing quietly beside her. The storm outside was steady, relentless, wrapping the city in silver sheets of motion. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Frank's eyes followed the harbor lights flickering in the distance, the same view he'd stared at after the hurricane years ago. He remembered telling Margaret once that storms never end, they just move. Looking at his daughter now, he realized some storms had to happen for people to learn to rebuild. The sirens faded into the distance. The sound of the rain took their place, softer now, no longer punishment, but cleansing. Emily leaned her head lightly against the window frame, her shoulders easing for the first time in months. Frank reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Outside, the rain kept falling, rhythmic and patient, washing the streets, the roofs, the city that had watched it all unfold. And for the first time in a long while, Frank didn't see destruction in the storm, only the quiet, possibility of renewal. The morning light spilled gently into Daniel Reed's office, catching the dust motes drifting lazily through the air. The room felt quieter than usual, softened by time and the end of chaos. Papers lay neatly stacked on his mahogany desk, each one stamped and signed, bound by the same calm precision that had carried the story from storm to stillness. Across from him, Emily sat with folded hands, her eyes following the sunlight across the wall. She looked different now, steadier, not untouched by grief, but tempered by it. The sharp edges of the past months had dulled into something closer to peace. Daniel adjusted his glasses and tapped the folder in front of him. "Your father asked me to deliver this," he said, his voice even, but softer than usual. "It's an update to the Harrison Trust. The final one." Emily's eyes flicked up. "Final?" He nodded. He made a few changes, nothing punitive. In fact, he slid the document toward her. It's one of the few times I've seen him add something that looked more like a gift than a clause. Emily hesitated, then opened the folder. Her father's handwriting filled the first page, his neat, methodical print in black ink. She began to read aloud softly. Inheritance to the primary heir, Emily Harrison Cole, shall activate only upon the establishment of a charitable foundation in the name of Margaret Price Harrison, dedicated to education, craftsmanship, and the preservation of honest trades. Her voice trembled halfway through, her thumb brushing the edge of the paper. She glanced up at Daniel, eyes bright. He wants me to build something in Margaret's name. Daniel smiled faintly. Your father believes what's earned should build more than comfort. He wanted you to have the means to continue what he started, only in your way. At that moment, the door opened behind them, and Margaret herself entered, her steps slow but steady. She carried that same unshakable calm she always had, though her eyes softened when she saw Emily holding the folder. He didn't tell me about this, she said quietly. Emily rose to meet her, emotion tightening her voice. He made you part of it, Aunt Margaret. He said it's time something carried your name too. Margaret took the papers from her gently, reading the clause in silence. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. He turned hurt into architecture, she murmured. He always did. The words settled between them with quiet gravity. Emily nodded, blinking back tears. He never built to destroy, she whispered, even his revenge. It was just rebuilding with truth. Margaret placed a hand over hers. Then you know what to do. By afternoon, the decision was made. Emily signed the preliminary forms, her name now attached to something her father would have called a structure with soul. The Margaret Price Foundation for Craft and Trade, scholarships for builders, carpenters, engineers, the kind of people her father believed kept the world upright while no one was watching. Daniel finalized the paperwork, stamping the documents with quiet satisfaction. He'll be pleased, he said. Emily smiled through tears. He already is. That evening, she stood at the pier near her apartment, the city lights glittering over the water. The rain had finally given way to clear skies, the air cool and still. She looked down at the folder in her hands, the foundation name printed neatly across the top. For the first time, it felt less like inheritance and more like purpose. Across town, Frank Harrison sat on the porch of his coastal home, a small radio humming beside him. He didn't need updates or reports. Daniel had already called, his message brief and enough. It's done. She signed it. Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the horizon where the sky met the sea. Margaret's name would outlive them all now, etched into the work of others. He imagined students learning the trades, hands steady with tools instead of ambition, and it filled the silence around him with something warm. Margaret called later that night, her voice light but thick with emotion. You could have told me, she said. I could have, Frank replied, but some things mean more when they're discovered, not announced. She laughed softly on the other end. You've closed every circle, haven't you? Frank didn't answer right away. He looked toward the half-finished bench near the porch railing, the one he'd started weeks ago and never completed. The wood waited, smooth and unfinished, like something still becoming. Not every circle, he said finally, just the ones that needed closing. He hung up, the sound of the ocean filling the quiet once more. Back at the harbor, Emily watched a ship drift past, its lights moving slowly across the black water. She pressed the folder to her chest, whispering, You built forever, Dad. The night breeze caught her hair, carrying her words out toward the sea, toward the house where a quiet man sat beneath the stars, content not to be seen, only to know that balance had finally been restored. The countermove was complete. 6 months later, Charleston dressed itself in light. The same hotel ballroom that once glittered with wedding flowers and false laughter now shone with a quieter elegance. Soft gold lighting, banners reading the Margaret Price Foundation for Craft and Trade, and long tables adorned not with extravagance, but purpose. Where champagne towers once mirrored vanity, now stood a wall of framed photographs, young apprentices, weathered builders, veterans in work gear, their faces proud beneath the foundation's crest. Emily stood near the entrance, poised and calm, greeting guests as they arrived. Her dress was understated, her expression open, confident in a way she hadn't been before. Every handshake carried meaning, every thank you, genuine. This night wasn't about spectacle, it was about building something that would stand when the applause faded. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The press had already drawn their comparisons. From wedding scandal to social renewal, one headline read that morning. The same hotel, the same city, a different woman entirely. At the back of the room, unnoticed by most, Frank Harrison stood beside a small group of veterans, men whose hands had built both his reputation and their own futures. They wore their best suits, a little stiff in their collars, but proud. Frank blended among them, content in the shadows, his eyes sweeping the room with quiet observation. Daniel joined him briefly, holding 2 glasses of water. "You could have sat up front," he said, offering one. "I prefer the foundation of things," Frank replied, nodding toward the crowd. "Less pressure on the structure when you stand in the back." Daniel smiled. "She's come a long way." Frank's eyes softened. She was always going to. She just had to tear down what wasn't meant to last. The lights dimmed slightly as the MC stepped onto the stage. The hum of conversation quieted. Emily took her place behind the podium, her notes trembling slightly in her hand before she steadied them. Her gaze moved across the audience, landing briefly on the far wall, where she knew, without needing to see, that her father was watching. 6 months ago, she began, this foundation was just an idea, a clause in a trust, a piece of paper with a name. But my father once told me that blueprints mean nothing until someone believes in the building. Tonight, you've proven him right. Applause rippled softly through the room. She continued, voice gaining strength. The Margaret Price Foundation isn't just about skill or trade. It's about dignity. It's about giving people the tools to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives. It's about integrity. The same kind my father spent his life teaching, sometimes quietly, sometimes stubbornly, but always completely. Her voice faltered just slightly before she smiled. Dad, wherever you are in this room, thank you for building values that last. The applause swelled, rising like the tide, steady, sincere, and warm. Frank stood still among the veterans, his face unreadable. One of the men beside him clapped him on the shoulder. "She's proud of you," he said. Frank nodded once. He didn't smile, but his eyes glistened faintly. "She built this herself," he murmured. "That's what matters." Photographers turned their lenses toward Emily, the lights catching her in a soft halo. Across the ballroom, screens flickered with images from earlier years, the old construction site, the pier, the veteran housing project. Then, in a subtle transition, the footage from her wedding flashed briefly. A younger Emily, Blake at her side, Frank sitting at the end of a table, ignored. The contrast was jarring, intentional, powerful. The caption beneath the images read, "From loss to legacy." In the corner, Frank's attention was drawn by a waiter weaving through the crowd. The young man stopped before him, a folded note resting on a silver tray. "For you, sir," he said quietly. Frank frowned slightly and unfolded the paper. One line, written in Daniel's tidy script. "Blake's back in town." For a long moment, the noise of the gala seemed to fade, replaced by the slow rush of blood in his ears. He read the words again, then folded the note neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Daniel approached moments later, his expression unreadable. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. Frank didn't answer right away. He looked toward the stage, where Emily now mingled with guests, laughter returning to her voice for the first time in years. Then his gaze shifted to the rain, beginning to streak the tall windows behind her. Charleston rain, inevitable, familiar. He set his glass down on the table, nodded once to Daniel, and turned toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool, the rain soft but steady. The glow of the gala spilled faintly through the glass doors behind him, but he didn't look back. He walked down the stone steps, coat collar turned up against the drizzle. The same weather that once marked humiliation now felt like prelude, Because some storms didn't destroy, they simply returned, waiting to see what kind of man was left standing this time. The sky over Charleston was slate gray again, the air thick with salt and coming rain. Frank Harrison stood on the porch of his coastal house, sanding a strip of cedar for a new railing. The rhythmic scrape of sandpaper was steady, almost meditative. The tide below rolled in slow, deliberate waves, lapping against the pilings of the old dock that had long since begun to collapse under years of neglect. He didn't hear the car at first, just the crunch of tires on gravel, the hesitant rhythm of someone unsure whether they should have come at all. Frank set the sandpaper down, turned, and saw him. Blake Cole stood at the edge of the drive, soaked to the bone, unshaven, his once tailored life now wrinkled and hanging off him like borrowed fabric. His shoes were caked in mud, his eyes were hollow, the kind of emptiness only consequence can carve. Frank didn't move, didn't speak. Blake took a few steps closer, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "The business, the accounts, even the house." His voice cracked on the last word, the remnants of pride crumbling with it. "I don't have anywhere left to go." The wind picked up, scattering rain across the porch boards. Frank simply studied him. The man who'd once stood under chandeliers calling him useless now looked like a ghost of that arrogance. Blake swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to know how to start. Again." Frank's face didn't change. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound was the tide below and the faint creak of the porch in the wind. Then, without a word, Frank stepped past him, walking down toward the shoreline. Blake followed, confused but too desperate to stop. At the end of the path, Frank paused beside the broken dock. The middle section had rotted through completely, planks warped, nails rusted, boards missing. It was a slow decay, one that no storm had caused, but years of neglect had ensured. He handed Blake the shovel he kept leaning by the railing. Blake stared at it, bewildered. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Frank pointed toward the hole in the dock. "Start there," he said simply. "It's rotted from neglect." Blake hesitated, rain running down his face, before gripping the shovel. The wood felt heavy, unfamiliar. He stepped into the mud and began digging out the old posts, every movement clumsy, uncertain. The tide crept higher as the afternoon dragged on, washing over his shoes, soaking his jeans, but he didn't stop. Sweat mixed with rain, hands blistering where soft palms met hard work. From the porch, Frank watched, unmoving. He didn't offer advice or sympathy. He just observed, the way Blake avoided eye contact, the way he paused every few minutes as if waiting for praise that wouldn't come. The man had spent his life taking shortcuts, outsourcing effort, buying his way around discomfort. But there were no shortcuts here. The hours passed quietly. The sun broke briefly through the clouds near evening, casting gold across the water, the dock, the man trying and failing to fix what had been left too long. By sunset, Blake dropped the shovel and stood back, breathing hard. The dock looked no better than when he'd begun, though the ground around it was freshly torn and uneven, a sign of effort, not progress. He wiped his hands on his shirt, eyes flicking toward Frank. For a second, it looked like he might speak, might thank him, or apologize. But instead, he turned and walked up the path toward his car. No words, no farewell, just the sound of wet shoes on gravel fading into the distance. Frank stayed on the porch, the last of the sun dipping below the horizon. The waves pushed softly against the dock's remains, rocking the boards back and forth like an unsteady heartbeat. He looked toward the shovel still half buried in the sand, then at the place where Blake had stood moments ago. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and rain, heavy but cleansing. Frank exhaled, slow and quiet. "Still doesn't know the difference," he muttered to himself, voice barely louder than the tide, "between repair and rebuild." Lightning flickered far out over the ocean, illuminating the unfinished dock for just a moment, an echo of what could stand again someday if someone learned how. The morning sun crept across Charleston like a slow exhale, glinting off puddles left by last night's rain. In front of every cafe, folded newspapers waited to be claimed. each bearing the same bold headline stretched across the top, from wedding humiliation to humanitarian legacy. Below it, a large photo of Frank Harrison filled the page. He stood beside a line of veterans, all in work boots and faded caps, their faces lit with the kind of pride that can't be bought. The caption beneath read, "70-year-old contractor turns family scandal into citywide mission of rebuilding." By 8 a.m., Charleston had already begun to talk. At a downtown coffee shop, the bell above the door chimed as Blake Cole stepped inside. The room smelled of espresso and damp air, the kind of warmth that made strangers lean close. He ordered quietly, head low, baseball cap pulled tight over his eyes. But when he reached for a napkin, his hand froze. There it was, his story, or what was left of it, spread open on the counter beside someone's latte. Frank's face smiling back. The same man he'd mocked, outlasted, and tried to erase. Now front-page redemption in print. Blake grabbed a paper of his own, flipping through it with trembling hands. The article pulled no punches. Once dismissed as a relic, Frank Harrison's values of craftsmanship and integrity have become Charleston's blueprint for renewal. Through his foundation's partnership with local veterans, over a dozen homes have already been restored in the city's oldest neighborhoods. Halfway down the column, a pull quote caught his eye. He was called useless once. Now his work speaks for itself. He stared at the words until they blurred. Around him, the murmur of customers shifted. A woman by the window whispered to her friend, her voice soft but pointed. "That's him," she said. "The husband, from that story." Blake's chest tightened. He turned slightly, catching the side glances, recognition mixed with judgment. Someone else murmured, "He's aged 10 years since the trial." Another, "Guess karma's got good timing." The barista placed his coffee down gently, avoiding his eyes. "Here you go, sir." He didn't take it. Instead, he folded the newspaper in half, then in half again, until the edges crumpled in his fists. He shoved it into the trash on his way out, the doorbell jangling in his wake. Outside, the air was cold and damp, the remnants of the storm still clinging to the streets. The rain began again, thin, persistent. It beaded on his jacket, ran down his face. He walked aimlessly for blocks, the city that once admired him, now foreign and indifferent. His reflection caught briefly in a storefront window, tired, small, almost unrecognizable. He didn't stop to look. Across town, Emily Harrison sat in her foundation office, sunlight streaming across her desk. The same article lay framed in glass before her. The photo of her father, hands in pockets, smile small but real, looked back at her like an answer she hadn't known she needed. She'd chosen the headline to display intact, untrimmed. It wasn't about the scandal or the success. It was about the arc between them. She smiled softly, tracing the edge of the frame with one fingertip before setting it upright beside her lamp. Behind her, Margaret stepped in quietly, a cup of coffee in hand. She paused to read the headline again, her eyes warming. "He earned what he was called that day," she said softly. And then he rewrote it. Emily looked up. "He didn't need to change the story," she said. "Just the ending." Margaret smiled. "That's what builders do." That evening, at the Coastal House, Frank sat on his porch, the paper folded neatly on the table beside him. He hadn't read the whole piece. Didn't need to. The photograph had said enough. Margaret had called earlier, teasing him about being Charleston's newest folk hero. He'd laughed once, then changed the subject to the weather. Now, as the tide rolled in under a bruised sky, he picked up the paper again. The print was smudged slightly from her fingerprints. He studied his own image, the veterans behind him, the houses taking shape in the background. The story wasn't pride. It was permanence. "Let it stand as blueprint," he murmured. The wind lifted the page slightly, just enough for the photo to shift in the lamplight. The foundation of the pier below creaked softly, steady against the rising water. In the distance, thunder rolled again, low, familiar, inevitable. The old courthouse smelled of varnish and paper, centuries of power compressed into one echoing room. The air carried the quiet hum of opportunists, developers, bankers, and speculators, all waiting for their next acquisition. On this gray Charleston morning, The gavel would fall again and again, turning loss into opportunity. At the front of the room, a clerk adjusted his microphone. "Next item," he announced, voice steady and official. "Lot 43, the Cole family property, King Street. Historic residence, 4 bedrooms, Georgian style. Starting bid, $800,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Cole house wasn't just another property. It was an emblem of old Charleston wealth, its brickwork older than some of the men bidding. Generations of Cole portraits had once hung inside its halls. Now, it was another line item on the liquidation list of a fallen name. Daniel Reed sat near the center of the room, bidding paddle resting calmly on his knee. He wore no tie, no display of arrogance, just composure, as usual. His presence went mostly unnoticed until the bidding began. 900,000, 950, 1 million. Daniel lifted his paddle, tone even. 1.1. The auctioneer nodded briskly. "We have 1.1. Do I hear 1.2? A banker across the aisle hesitated, whispering to his partner. The hesitation was enough. Within moments, the bids stalled. The gavel came down hard, echoing through the chamber. Sold. 1.1 million to the Harrison Trust. The crowd rustled with interest. Reporters in the back exchanged glances, pens scratching across notepads. The symbolism was too perfect to ignore. The man who'd been mocked at his daughter's wedding now owned the estate of the man who had done the mocking. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into Frank's coastal house, the deed folder tucked neatly under his arm. Frank was sitting at his desk, reading through construction plans for a new shelter wing. "It's done," Daniel said simply. "King Street is ours." Frank didn't look up right away. He signed one last note in the margin before setting down his pen. "Not ours," he said. "Emily's." Daniel frowned slightly. "You're transferring it?" Frank nodded. "The foundation needs office space, and the upstairs rooms will make good transitional housing. Solid structure, central location, and it'll stay useful." Daniel smiled faintly, admiration flickering behind his professionalism. "You know the press will eat this up." "They'll call it poetic," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "They always do when justice looks like irony." By evening, the headlines confirmed it. "From empire to shelter, Cole Estate becomes home for the homeless. Poetic urban renewal. Harrison Trust funds restoration of former rival's mansion." The photos showed the grand facade of the King Street home, scaffolding already up, workers moving through its iron gates. Reporters lingered nearby, snapping pictures of volunteers hauling boxes and tools. One of the local anchors summed it up perfectly. Charleston's story comes full circle. Across town, Blake Cole watched the coverage through the fogged window of a small coffee shop. The television mounted above the counter flickered between talking heads and aerial footage of the house. His hands trembled slightly as he stirred his untouched coffee, the spoon clinking against the cup. He didn't hear the barista call his name, didn't feel the cold draft from the open door. The news anchor's voice was calm, almost gentle. The King Street property, once the pride of the Cole family, will now serve as the headquarters of the Margaret Price Foundation, a project founded by Emily Harrison, daughter of Frank Harrison. The restoration begins next week. The camera cut to Emily standing on the front steps, a hard hat perched on her head. Her smile was small but sure, the kind that came from purpose, not pride. Blake's reflection stared back at him from the window, unshaven, hollow-eyed, unrecognizable. He let out a single, bitter laugh. "Of course," he muttered. "He built a monument out of me." The woman at the next table looked up briefly, but he was already standing, chair scraping across the tile. He tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter and walked out into the street. The air was sharp, rain threatening again. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The city that once opened doors for him now seemed to close them as he passed. Behind him, through the coffee shop window, the television played on, Frank Harrison's name framed under the words, "Legacy and Renewal." Meanwhile, miles away on the coast, Frank watched the same report in silence. Margaret sat across from him, tea cooling beside her untouched. "It's over," she said quietly. Frank's eyes stayed on the screen, where the image of the restored mansion faded into the foundation's logo. "No," he said, voice calm. It's finished. There's a difference. He reached forward and turned off the television. The screen went black, reflecting his face faintly in the dark glass. Outside, the rain began again, soft and persistent, tapping against the window like the sound of nails driving into fresh wood. Revenge, finally, was complete, signed, sealed, and deeded, not in anger, in ink. The warning came before dawn. Local stations cut through their usual chatter with the same phrase Charleston had learned to fear. Category 2, hurricane approaching the coast. Landfall expected within 12 hours. Frank Harrison stood by the window of his coastal house, watching the dark horizon churn. The wind had already started pushing against the pier, the boards creaking like an old man's knees. Storms were nothing new to him. He'd built his career and his life around enduring them. But this one felt different, not because of its strength, but because of what it might wash clean. By mid-morning, the town was alive with movement. Volunteers loaded sandbags, boarded up windows, and hauled supplies. The pier, now a community hub, had turned into a command center for the Foundation's relief efforts. Trucks came and went under gray skies. Frank moved among them quietly, sleeves rolled up, handing out gear, checking generator cables. His presence anchored the chaos, steady, wordless, efficient. Inside the makeshift shelter, Emily coordinated logistics with Margaret at her side. Their voices carried calm authority over the hum of radios and the clatter of crates. "Food distribution first," Emily ordered, her hair pulled back, face streaked with sweat. "Medical next. Keep the veterans near the loading dock. They know the drill." Margaret smiled faintly. "Your father would approve of the order." Emily glanced toward the pier, visible through the open door, where Frank was directing workers through the wind. "He doesn't need to," she said quietly. "He built it into me." As the rain thickened, the tide surged against the seawall. The sky turned an angry slate, clouds swirling low. Frank grabbed a rope and started helping secure boats along the dock. Lightning flashed, brief, white, immediate. That's when he saw him. Blake Cole, soaked through, sleeves rolled, hauling crates of bottled water from a pickup truck. His hair was longer now, his face lined with exhaustion, but his movements were purposeful. No arrogance, no pretense, just work. Their eyes met across the pier. For a moment, time stopped, and the sound of the storm filled everything between them. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just nodded once, and Blake returned it silently, before setting another crate down and moving on. All afternoon, they worked side by side. The storm howled around them, wind whipping through their clothes, rain blinding, boards groaning under the weight of water. They tied down supplies, cleared debris, helped families into trucks heading inland. No words, just rhythm, just effort. Margaret watched from the shelter doorway, her hands gripping the frame. "Well," she murmured half to herself, "maybe some storms rebuild what others destroy." By nightfall, the hurricane had passed. It wasn't as fierce as predicted, but fierce enough to remind Charleston who was boss. The air was thick with salt and the smell of wet wood. Floodwater glistened under streetlights, retreating slowly into the drains. Frank stood by the pier rail, soaked, exhausted, watching the tide ease back into its rhythm. His hands trembled slightly from the cold, but his mind was quiet. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. Blake approached, his clothes torn, hands blistered from rope work. His eyes carried the look of someone who'd been humbled by something larger than himself. He hesitated before speaking. "I didn't know where else to help," he said, voice raw. Frank studied him for a moment, then reached into a cooler beside him and pulled out a thermos. He poured 2 cups of coffee, steam curling into the damp air, and handed one over. "No contracts," Frank said. "No trusts, just work." Blake took it carefully, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the warm metal. "Thank you," he murmured, the words catching slightly, as though he wasn't used to saying them. Frank nodded once, no smile, no bitterness, just quiet acknowledgement. Then he turned and began walking back toward the shelter, boots splashing through the puddles. Blake stood there for a while, sipping the coffee, watching the man disappear into the faint glow of generator lights. The storm had stripped the city bare, leaving it raw, honest, and clean. As dawn crept in, the clouds broke open, revealing the Charleston skyline washed in soft gold. The camera would rise from the pier, boards still slick, ropes still wet, to the rooftops glittering with morning light. Every repaired shingle, every shining gutter, every standing wall caught the sun like a silent promise. Some things, once rebuilt right, will always hold. And down below, two men who had once shared only ruin, now shared the same silence, the kind earned not through forgiveness, but through work. The storm had passed 2 weeks ago, but its scent still lingered in the air, salt, pine, and something clean, like renewal. Frank Harrison sat at his work table near the window of his coastal home, a single lamp casting warm light over a scattering of papers. The steady tick of the clock filled the silence, mingling with the faint roll of the ocean outside. A legal pad lay before him, lines of careful handwriting filling the page. His pen moved slowly, deliberately. There was no rush anymore, only precision. Every word mattered now. Every clause was a nail, every sentence a beam in the framework of what he was building to outlast himself. At the top of the page, in bold, confident script, he'd written, "Amendment to the Harrison Trust." He paused, exhaled, and read aloud softly to himself, his voice low but firm. "To be executed upon my passing, naming Margaret Price as executor and primary steward of all trust operations." The next line came easily, his pen scratching through the quiet. "Ensure legacy stays with builders, not boasters." He stopped for a moment and smiled faintly. It wasn't cynicism that guided his hand anymore, just clarity. The years had taught him that legacies rot when handed to those who see inheritance as ownership rather than responsibility. Builders kept things alive. Boasters buried them in vanity. The papers on his desk fluttered slightly as a gust of sea wind pressed against the window. Frank leaned back, listening to the sound. Somewhere in that wind, he thought he could almost hear his wife's laugh. Soft, restrained, the kind that used to fill the edges of their kitchen on Sunday mornings. He smiled again, this time without bitterness. The next clause he wrote came without hesitation. "Profits derived from the King Street property shall be donated annually to apprenticeship and trade programs for veterans and disadvantaged youth." He underlined it once, firm and straight. It wasn't just charity, it was design. The house that once symbolized greed would now fund the steady hands of those who built rather than took. There was poetry in that, but also justice. The sound of footsteps drew him from his thoughts. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back, a file tucked under one arm. She leaned against the frame, smiling softly. "Still drafting, I see." Frank looked up over his glasses. "Some people knit in their spare time. I revise estate plans." She chuckled, stepping closer, glancing down at the papers. "You know, Frank, most men your age talk about golf or grandkids, not trust amendments." "Golf doesn't fix anything," he said, eyes twinkling faintly. Margaret scanned the page, her smile deepening. "Ensure legacy stays with builders, not boasters." She looked up at him. "You're still an architect of words, too." He shrugged. "Old habits. Some structures don't collapse easy." Her gaze softened. "Even retirement can't retire you." He leaned back in his chair, the faintest grin pulling at his mouth. "Can't waste good materials." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind built on decades of shared storms, some literal, some emotional. Margaret reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder for a moment before she turned to leave. "I'll make sure it stands, Frank," she said, "every word of it." When she was gone, he sat back down and looked at the final blank line on the page. For a long while, he didn't write anything. The lamp hummed softly. The tide outside shifted with the moon. Then he picked up his pen one last time and added the closing sentence in neat, careful strokes. "Measure twice, forgive once." He stared at the words, the quote that had belonged to his wife, the one she used to tease him with whenever he rebuilt something she thought was already fine. He whispered them aloud, almost reverently. "Measure twice, forgive once." It wasn't instruction this time. It was surrender. He placed the pen beside the document, folded it neatly into an envelope marked "To Margaret," and sealed it. Outside, the sound of waves against the pier echoed steady and low. The lamp flickered slightly as the wind shifted again, rustling the edge of the envelope, like a nod from the woman who'd always known when his work was finally done. Frank smiled faintly into the "eat." Quiet. A man who had learned that forgiveness, like building, took patience, and sometimes a second measurement. The Charleston Museum smelled faintly of varnish and new paint, a scent of preservation and pride. Light spilled through high windows onto the polished floor where chairs had been arranged in clean rows. The banners hanging from the rafters read in deep Navy script, "Dedication Ceremony, the Frank Harrison Wing." For the first time in his life, Frank felt uncomfortable in a building he hadn't built. The walls were too smooth, too perfect, the air too still. He tugged once at his cuff, the faintest sign of restlessness, as guests murmured behind him. The city's mayor stood near the podium, shaking hands and smiling for photographs. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered notes into phones. Emily approached, elegant but grounded in a simple navy dress. Her eyes were bright with emotion she hadn't yet allowed to surface. "You ready?" she asked softly. Frank gave a small shrug. "I was ready before they decided to make it public." She smiled faintly. "You earned this." He didn't reply. His gaze had drifted toward the plaque, still covered by a velvet cloth, waiting to be revealed. He already knew what it said, but seeing it in front of an audience made it feel heavier somehow, like a blueprint turned monument. The ceremony began. The mayor stepped up to the podium, voice polished and performative. "Today we honor not just a builder of homes, but a builder of values," he said. Frank Harrison's hands shaped Charleston's skyline, but his heart shaped its conscience. The applause was polite, measured. Cameras clicked. Then the mayor turned toward him. "Mr. Harrison, would you do us the honor?" Frank stepped forward slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Emily and Margaret stood off to the side, both watching with quiet pride. With one smooth motion, Frank pulled the cloth from the plaque. The words were simple, unpretentious, just like him. Built by hands they called useless. A murmur spread through the room, some recognizing the phrase, others remembering the viral headline from years ago. The moment hung in the air, fragile but powerful. Frank cleared his throat, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice steady but low. "What's on that wall is enough. It's not about what people called you, it's about what you keep building anyway." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "My father used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't how much he leaves behind, but how well what he built holds up after he's gone." He looked toward the plaque, then back to the crowd. "If anything I made still stands tomorrow, that's more than enough." He stepped back. The applause rose, louder now, filling the hall. Some clapped for the man, some for the words, but all for the truth. Frank gave a polite nod and returned to his seat. Emily met him, halfway, arms wrapping around him tightly. For a moment, the cameras disappeared, and it was just father and daughter, two architects of the same redemption. She whispered against his shoulder, voice trembling, "You built more than structures, Dad. You built me." Frank smiled faintly, his hand steadying her arm. "Then make it mean something," he said. He didn't need to say what it was. She already knew. Across the room, near the edge of the crowd, a familiar figure lingered, half hidden behind a column. Blake Cole, unshaven but sober, stood watching from a distance. His clothes were plain, his expression unreadable. But when Frank's name drew another wave of applause, his eyes glistened, the tears catching light before he quickly blinked them away. He didn't move closer, didn't try to speak. Just stood there, head bowed slightly, as if the sound of the crowd itself was enough penance. From her place near the aisle, Margaret saw him. Her eyes softened for just a heartbeat, but she said nothing. Some stories, she knew, had to finish in silence. The mayor closed the ceremony with one last line about legacy and community, but the real words that lingered were Frank's, the kind that didn't fade when the microphones turned off. As people filed out, Frank remained seated, staring quietly at the plaque on the wall. His reflection caught faintly in its polished brass surface, older, steadier, at peace. Outside, through the tall glass doors, the Charleston sun was breaking through a morning haze. The city gleamed, rooftops glistening from the rain the night before. And for the first time in years, Frank felt it. Not triumph, not vindication, just closure. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles gently, like dust after a long day's work. The afternoon light slanted gold across the harbor, soft and heavy, the kind that made everything look touched by memory. The pier stretched out like a wooden scar into the calm water, salt-stained and solid, despite years of storms. Frank Harrison moved slowly down its length, a hammer in one hand, a small wooden plaque in the other. Behind him, Emily carried a folded blanket, and Margaret followed with a thermos of coffee. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air itself carried something reverent, the hush of things coming full circle. At the very end of the pier stood a new bench, oak and iron, sturdy, clean. Frank ran his palm along the backrest, testing the grain, feeling the weight of the wood beneath his fingertips. He'd built hundreds of structures in his lifetime, but this one felt personal in a way the others never had. "This is the spot," he said quietly. Emily looked out across the water where the late sun shimmered like copper. "Where you scattered Mom's ashes," he nodded. "Right here. She always said the sea made sense of everything." Margaret set down the thermos and smiled faintly. "You still make things that last, Frank, even when they're not meant to." Frank lifted the plaque and knelt to fasten it to the back of the bench. The letters carved into the wood were simple, unpolished, the kind that felt meant to be read slowly. "Strength is quiet." When he finished tightening the last screw, he sat down, letting the boards creak softly under his weight. Emily and Margaret joined him, one on each side. The three of them sat there for a while, just watching the harbor breathe. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into layers of pink and blue and soft fire. Seagulls circled lazily overhead, their cries distant, carried by the wind. Somewhere behind them, the faint melody of a street musician drifted down the dock, a slow tune on an old guitar, mournful and sweet. Frank leaned back, eyes on the horizon. "You know," he said after a long pause, "your mother used to sit here with a sketchbook, drew houses she'd never see built, said it helped her understand how I saw the world." Emily smiled faintly. "I think she'd like this one." "I hope so." He folded his hands, the motion slow, deliberate. "I built it the way she lived. No fuss, no noise, just enough to hold." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and wood and distant rain. Emily looked at her father, the lines of age and weather etched deeply into his face. "Do you ever miss the wedding day?" she asked softly. Frank's gaze didn't waver from the water. "Only what it could have been," he said, "not what it was." She nodded, understanding. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just full, like the pause between waves. After a moment, Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He turned it over in his hand before placing it gently in Emily's palm. She looked down, puzzled. "What's this?" He nodded for her to open it. Inside lay a gold ring, simple, worn smooth by time. Her mother's ring. "I think it's time it came home," he said quietly. Emily's breath caught. "Dad, I can't—" "Yes," he interrupted softly. "You can. It's not about marriage or promises. It's about trust. And I trust you to keep what matters standing." She closed her hand around the ring, tears blurring the horizon. Margaret looked away toward the sea, eyes bright but smiling. The three of them sat there as the sun sank fully, the last light glinting off the plaque's carved words. "Strength is quiet." The tide whispered against the pier pilings, patient and eternal. The city lights blinked to life across the water, one by one, until the whole skyline shimmered like the reflection of something mended. Emily slid the ring onto her finger, just to feel its weight. Frank watched but said nothing. His expression was calm, peaceful in a way that had eluded him for years. The music on the wind faded, the gulls settled, the tide rose and fell. And as the first stars emerged above Charleston, peace didn't announce itself. It just arrived, quiet and steady, like the tide coming home. The morning air carried a sharp chill, the kind that comes only after a night of rain. The pier glistened under the pale Charleston sun, its wet boards catching the light like mirrors. Frank Harrison sat on his porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, his tools spread out beside him. He was carving the final slat for the bench, overlooking the water. A small job, but one that gave his hands something to do while his thoughts stayed busy. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled him from his focus. A car door shut, then slow footsteps approached the porch. Frank didn't turn immediately. He already knew the rhythm of that walk, hesitant, heavy, stripped of arrogance. Blake Cole stood at the edge of the steps, coat too light for the cold, hair trimmed, eyes clear for the first time in years. The weight of everything he'd lost clung to him like the salt wind, but there was something else beneath it, something quieter. Sobriety, maybe. "Morning," Frank said, setting down his chisel but not standing. "Morning," Blake echoed. His voice cracked slightly. He looked smaller somehow, less a man fallen from grace, and more one trying to find footing again. "I wasn't sure you'd see me." Frank gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "You're here. That's seeing enough." Blake sat slowly, hands clasped tight. The silence between them stretched, filled with years neither could quite name. Finally, Blake spoke. "I've been sober 6 months," he said. "No more shortcuts, no more pretending." Frank nodded once, eyes still on the horizon. "That's something," Blake exhaled. "I don't deserve a second chance." "You're right," Frank said, flat, without hesitation. Blake's eyes fell. The words hit, but they didn't wound the way they once might have. He'd already bled that pride out long ago. Frank let the silence hang, then added, "But you can earn one for someone else." Blake looked up, uncertain. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, creased, worn, already signed. He handed it over. "Emily's foundation. They need labor for the new housing site. It's long hours, hard work. No title, no corner office. You'll start with a shovel like I did." Blake unfolded the page, reading it in disbelief. His throat tightened. "You'd trust me with that?" Frank met his eyes for the first time. "Trust has to start somewhere. I'm not giving you forgiveness. I'm giving you a job." Blake's jaw worked, trying to keep composure. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," Frank said. "Just show up. That's how builders apologize." For a long moment, the only sound was the waves brushing against the pier. Then Blake nodded, slow and deliberate, tears breaking free despite his effort to stop them. He wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand, laughing once through the crack in his voice. "You really don't let a man off. Easy, do you?" Frank's lips curved slightly. "Easy doesn't last." Margaret appeared at the doorway, drawn by the voices. She took in the sight. Blake, hollow-eyed but honest, and Frank, still calm as ever. She understood before a word was said. "So," she said, folding her arms, "you're joining the foundation crew." Blake nodded. "If they'll have me." She gave a small, knowing smile. "They'll have you, not because you've been forgiven, but because you're finally accountable." Blake swallowed hard, the words hitting deeper than kindness ever could. "Thank you," he said, glancing from her to Frank. Margaret looked at Frank, her voice softer now. "You sure about this?" Frank stared out at the water, the waves catching light as they rolled. "Every structure needs a second layer," he said. "Doesn't mean the first one disappears. Just means it can finally hold." Blake stood, slipping the paper carefully into his coat pocket. "I'll be there Monday," he said quietly. Frank gave a single nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Bring your own gloves." As Blake walked down the pier, the camera would linger, on the man once gilded in arrogance, now just another worker moving towards something better. Margaret turned to Frank, her smile faint but real. "You know what this is, don't you?" Frank sipped his coffee, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Not forgiveness," he said. "Accountability." The two of them watched in silence as Blake's figure grew smaller against the light. The tide came in, calm and clean, washing the pier's edges smooth again. Poetic justice didn't need noise, it just needed time to stand. The sound of hammers carried across the morning air, steady, rhythmic, alive. The old lot on the edge of Charleston Harbor, once overgrown and forgotten, had become a hive of motion. Piles of lumber, stacks of bricks, and rows of fresh timber framed the skeletons of homes that would soon stand proud against the skyline. Frank Harrison stood at the edge of the site, rolled blueprints in hand, watching his crew work. The lines etched into his face caught the sun, his weathered hands smudged with graphite and sawdust. He wasn't overseeing a company project or a contract bid this time. This was something smaller and far greater. His final build, a cluster of modest homes with attached workshops, designed for veterans, young apprentices, and families starting over. Every design choice mattered: sturdy materials, simple layouts, room to learn, to live, to rebuild. It was his life's philosophy drawn into structure: usefulness over vanity, permanence over polish. A truck pulled up near the tool shed, its back loaded with supplies. Blake Cole climbed down, shoulders squared, eyes focused. He carried a beam across the gravel, sweat staining the collar of his work shirt. No one gave him special attention, and he didn't ask for it. The man who once mocked labor now did it, daily, quietly, methodically. Frank watched him for a while, arms folded. There was no judgment left, only observation. Blake was learning the trade the only way that mattered, with his hands. Nearby, Emily stood with a clipboard, going over invoices with Daniel. Her tone was calm but firm, the kind of authority earned through work, not inheritance. From the veranda of the site's temporary office, Margaret watched the three of them with quiet satisfaction, her teacup steaming in the cool air. Frank walked toward the main building, pausing to check a frame alignment. "Level's off by a quarter inch," he told one of the apprentices, handing him a tool. "Measure twice, cut once." The young man smiled, embarrassed. "Sorry, Mr. Harrison." Frank nodded. "Don't be sorry, just be sure." He stepped back, watching the boy correct the cut. Around him, the hum of construction blended into something almost musical: the scrape of saws, the thud of nails, the low murmur of collaboration. It wasn't chaos, it was harmony. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun arced overhead, throwing long beams of light through the half-finished windows. Blake wiped sweat from his brow and caught Frank's eye for a moment. A silent acknowledgement, nothing more. Respect didn't need words. Later that afternoon, as the last wall went up, Emily approached her father with a stack of papers. "Permits for final inspection," she said. "We're officially done." Frank took the folder, flipping through the documents. Each signature, each seal, felt like punctuation to a story he'd been writing for decades. His pen hovered over the last page. "Feels strange," Emily said softly, "finishing something that doesn't belong to just us." Frank smiled faintly. "That's what makes it worth finishing." He signed the permit with a slow, steady hand. Then, in one fluid motion, he removed his worn leather hat, the same one he'd worn since his contracting days, and hung it on the nail protruding from a new beam. The sound of the brim brushing wood echoed like closure. The site went quiet for a beat. Workers stood back, admiring the row of small houses, now glowing in the late afternoon light. The camera would pan wide, across clean rooftops, open windows, and sunlight flooding into rooms not yet lived in. Over the image, Frank's voice would rise in narration, calm and resolute. "Revenge built walls," he says. "Purpose built doors." As the sun dipped lower, Blake hauled the last pile of tools into storage. Emily checked off her final list, and Margaret smiled from the veranda, her reflection framed in the glass, like a ghost of grace. Frank stepped back from the site, boots crunching against gravel, the smell of sawdust thick in the air. His gaze lingered on the homes glowing in gold light, proof that not every ending has to destroy what came before. He exhaled, slow and quiet, the sound blending with the soft rustle of the coastal wind. Toeu. Life once built on loss had finished on creation. The camera would linger one last time on the hung hat. Still simple, final. Craft over anger, work over memory. Peace Finally, earned. Evening draped itself over Charleston like a soft, familiar coat. The harbor shimmered in shades of copper and violet, the water breathing slow against the pylons of the pier. Gulls wheeled lazily overhead, their cries muted by distance. Frank Harrison sat at the end of the pier, his silhouette outlined by the last spill of sunlight across the water. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and pine. Beside him, a small envelope fluttered against the worn wood, a letter postmarked 2 days earlier from the city's vocational program. He'd been meaning to read it all day, but had saved it for this moment, when everything was still. He slipped a calloused thumb beneath the seal and unfolded the page. The handwriting was uneven, earnest, the kind born of effort rather than ease. Mr. Harrison, thank you for believing in us. You taught me that useful hands never grow old. I used to think building was just a job. Now I know it's a way to stay alive. Caleb, apprentice carpenter. Frank read it twice, his lips curling faintly into a smile, the kind that doesn't reach for attention, just lingers quietly, earned, steady, real. He folded the paper carefully, pressing the crease as though sealing the words into memory, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his jacket. The tide lapped gently beneath the pier, the boards creaking in rhythm. Somewhere inland, church bells began to ring, soft at first, then swelling, carrying over the water. The sound rolled like time itself, patient and unhurried. Frank lifted his eyes toward the far shore. Along the stretch of sand below the pier, 2 figures walked side by side, Emily and Blake. Their steps were slow, uncoordinated but in sync, the kind of silence that spoke of a truce neither had named. Emily's hair caught the last of the light, turning gold at the edges. Blake kept his hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon. They didn't touch, didn't need to. Forgiveness, Frank thought, wasn't a handshake. It was just choosing to walk the same direction again. He watched them until they became outlines against the setting sun. For a moment, he looked back toward the city skyline, its glass and steel glowing faintly in the dusk. So much of it bore his hand, his design, his unseen work, the quiet proof of a man who'd built rather than talked. Charleston stood solid because he had refused to crumble. Frank rose slowly, his joints stiff but willing. The wind caught his coat, lifting it gently as he stepped closer to the edge of the pier. The golden light flickered across the rippling water, scattered like hundreds of small fires. He could almost see reflections of the homes he'd built, the faces of workers he'd taught, the echoes of laughter from a time when building still meant belonging. The harbor glowed brighter as the sun met the water, and his voice broke softly through the air, steady, resonant, as if meant not for anyone nearby, but for the world itself. The useless old man built forever. The words floated into the wind, carried across the harbor until they became part of the dusk, indistinguishable from the sound of the waves. He stood there for another moment, eyes on the horizon, the city lights blinking awake like stars. Then he sat back down on the bench he'd built with his own hands, the one carved with the phrase, "Strength is quiet." His fingers brushed the letters absently. The light shifted one last time, the sun melting completely into the water. The reflections on the harbor stretched and shimmered until all that remained was the calm pulse of gold against blue, the stillness after everything had been rebuilt. Somewhere behind him, the bells faded, replaced by the soft hum of the city breathing into night. Frank leaned back, letting the sea breeze wrap around him, the weight of years settling into peace. The camera would rise slowly from the pier, over the calm surface of the harbor, catching the trail of light glimmering across the water. A man alone, a city standing, and the last echo of purpose that had outlived revenge, fade to harbor light.